Hello, everyone, and welcome to this very special episode. It's not part of any series on the channel. This is just a standalone, casual, exploratory discussion into our respective understandings of history and political philosophy as it pertains to England and broader sort of European history. And we're focusing mainly on the idea of liberalism, English liberalism, and the idea of authentic reaction, or what it means to be a reactionary. I am very lucky to be joined by Carl Benjamin. Hello.
Hello.
How are you doing this evening?
I'm very well, thank you. I'm a big fan of your work on this channel. I've been subscribed, not for too long, actually. I wasn't, it's probably only about 6 months or so, but I've very much enjoyed the tenor of your historical discussions. I think they're excellent.
Well, thank you very much, Carl. That means so much. It sounded like AA there.
I really mean it.
Wonderful. Panama Hat, good to have you on.
Hello, good evening, and I would like to add to what Carl said. I'm a big fan of your historical streams and series. I know AA likes to call himself the Radio 4 of the right, but in my opinion, you are the true claimant to that title. Many hours of great informative listening I've got from your channel.
I don't mean to cast shade at AA, but definitely seconded on that point.
Yes, well, AA covers a much broader range of topics. I'm very much focused on my pedantic little area of study. So yes, in terms of an overarching structure, I have several sort of broad categories for our understandings of history and political philosophy. But before we go into that, I think it would be beneficial for not only ourselves but the audience to have like a general understanding of where we are each coming from. So Carl, what is your general perspective on English liberalism and political philosophy and European and English history in general?
God, that's a big question. Right, so I will contrast my perspective with what I will call I haven't got a ready name for it. I'll just call it French liberalism to distinguish it from what I'm going to be talking about, which is the full spectrum dominance of Enlightenment thought. And so everything is judged against the category of reason and whether it is self-justifying on those terms. Whereas I don't believe that what I consider to be liberalism was nearly as all-encompassing. And I think that actually calling it liberalism is kind of a misnomer, because it's not really just about the legal doctrine of liberalism and how this constitutionally relates to a person's relationship with the state. It becomes the entire way that they look at the world, and of course this leads us to modern progressive movements, which are absolute cancer. And the main, I think, issue that I have with the way, I would say, I'm going to vulgarly call it the reactionaries, but I don't mean to paint with too broad a brush when I say that. But what I think the issue is with the reactionaries is actually kind of with that, because this is new. It's a novel thing that has not even necessarily emerged. I mean, it has emerged, but it's been a conscious decision for this to emerge, and it's the constant march of progress. And that's simply not what I'm thinking of when I think of the liberal tradition of England. And moreover, it contrasts with the reactionary position in a way, and the reactionary position takes an opinion on French liberalism and broad brushes it to liberalism as a political or legal concept in a way that essentially negates the traditions of England. And as an Englishman, I don't really want to let that go quite so easily. And I'm not even sure if there is a sort of middle way either. That's the thing. I'm not saying I have all of the answers or anything like that. But sorry, I know I'm going on here, but like, so I would say that liberalism was how to describe it. There's a British philosopher called Michael Oakeshott. He's dead now. But he viewed ideologies as the crib, as in the spark notes of political traditions. And so when John Locke is codifying what he thinks to be human rights or the rights of man, and this is adopted by Rousseau and various other French thinkers, and becomes the foundational spirit of the French Revolution. Michael Oakeshott viewed the rights of man as a political crib through Locke of just the rights of Englishmen. And so through this lens, the whole idea of the Enlightenment kind of looks like the people on the continent being jealous of what the English have managed to achieve with their historic political traditions and trying to abstract it into an ideology and apply it to the entire human race. Whereas I don't see this as being something that is applicable to the entire human race. I view what I guess I'll term English liberalism as being the historic inheritance and right of Englishmen, and I don't care what the foreigners do with their time. So this, I think, is why the rights of man has such a poor mooring in anything that I think a reactionary would take time to appreciate. Whereas as an Englishman, I feel I'm almost bound to appreciate the heritage and history that I've got here, and I'm not prepared to simply negate it all because the French have done something balmy with it. I think that probably outlines my position there. I hope that was clear.
Thank you, Carl. And Panama Hat, the same question to you.
Could you just repeat the question? Sorry, just make sure I get it accurately.
Yes, it was. I just want a sort of overview of your sort of broad conception of what it is to be a reactionary, how this, also interacts with your own understanding and appreciation of history. And of course, I should mention for both Carl and Panama Hat that Carl just did a splendid video over on the Lotus Eaters concerning conservatism. And Panama Hat, you just did a wonderful video concerning what it means to be an authentic reactionary, focusing on the works of Davila. So that could be quite a good sort of starting point to get into.
Yes. Thank you. And most of the videos on my channel, I try and cover it in some way. But to answer the question, the kind of what I see as the core of authentic reaction is basically taking the history of the West and kind of looking into the values that built the civilizations that we admire and that we come from. We are kind of at this point where, in the present moment, where everything is kind of shipwrecked, if you will. I think everything has been washed up, and there are only very, very few things that have survived that. And basically, what I would say I'm trying to do with this idea is basically comb through and find the values which, as I say, built the civilizations we come from, and look into how we can preserve them and go on to basically in the future resurrect them in some way, would be the simplest way to put it. And just to kind of draw on this point that Carl was making about English liberty, there's basically a lot of points of agreement here, because I would say looking at the history of it, the history of the West, a country like England and a lot of the cultures of the British Isles in particular, and I should say I'm not actually English, I'm of Welsh extraction personally, but there is this kind of long history of what I would call concrete liberty. Goes back, far into the ancient times. It's there with the Saxons and the medieval cultures as well, and it survives a very, very long time. This kind of very decentralized, very, very, very liberty heavy culture in the British Isles, which is in contrast to various states on the continent. You could say that perhaps the polar opposite would be a state like Russia, as it evolved for different reasons entirely. I want to make clear at the beginning here that we as reactionaries, or at least the strand that I represent, is very loving of that concrete liberty. I draw an enormous line between liberty and what I would consider to be liberalism, which to me, perhaps this is a purely semantic thing, but it's the thing that kind of it's the poison in the root, if you will, that began to kind of take something that was very admirable and good, and as you say, that people outside of the culture began to covet, and kind of turned it on its head in a way, and kind of with the cry of freedom began to subvert institutions and subvert cultures and subvert entire nations, basically. And that is what I believe I'm reacting against, essentially.
Well, thank you for that, Panama. Just to put my own thoughts out there, I do intend to be more of an arbitrator than an active participant. Nevertheless, I have quite a few things I would like to say. But just in terms of getting over my own perspective, obviously, I'm not a political philosopher, nor will I ever claim to be a political philosopher. I'm primarily a historian. So whenever I'm looking at ideas, it's to essentially inform my understanding of historical events. And therefore, all my sort of understanding of the philosophy, political philosophy, is grounded in historical examples. If I were to come to, again, a less of an abstract example, but a concrete example of how to explain my own sort of perception, I find myself in a situation where there is no sort of institutional body or really any nation which sort of represents me anymore. Any sort of notion of Englishness to me is long gone that I can actually relate to. And there was this movement that arose outside of the just after the French Revolution. You have the fall of Napoleon twice, and you have the Restoration, and it produces quite a strong conservative backlash. And there is already, beginning with this Restoration, quite a lot of pent-up frustration at the liberal compromises made by, again, the man ostensibly there to herald in the restoration of the old regime. This was Louis XVIII, and the people in opposition to Louis XVIII were called ultras, i.e. beyond just being royalists. It wasn't enough to be a royalist because the king had failed in his duty to uphold royalism. So this is a sort of term I apply to myself because it distinguishes people like me from mainstream conservatism or the ideology espoused by current institutions, including the monarchy, in fact, including the church. So to be a ultra is to be more royalist in this case than the Queen, or in my sort of literal case, more sort of conservative than the conservative outlets are there out there. But relaying this back to trying to find some sort of historical rooting, because I think much of our conversation is going to revolve about the 17th century in England, where we could have had an absolutist system, we could have had a republic. Instead, we ended up with a form of parliamentary monarchy post 1688. And to my mind, the sort of dividing line between some sort of visible form of English conservatism was with the exclusion crisis in 1679. Which pitted, again, this is where we have the definition of high Tories and Whigs. And we also have two intellectual champions for each side. With the high Tory tradition, we have a Robert Palmer and his Patriarcha. And with the Whig side, we have John Locke.
Sorry to interrupt. Wasn't that not Robert Filmer?
Yes, sorry, Robert Filmer. Thank you.
Right. Just sorry, it was purely for my own. I was keeping track of where we are, basically.
No, absolutely. Do correct me. Absolutely.
I wasn't trying to be arrogant.
No, I feel embarrassed now. But yes, Robert Filmer. Absolutely. Thank you, Carl. And of course, in opposition, John Locke and his two treatises of government, which were written in direct response to Filmer. But of course, right from the outset, English conservatism, high Toryism was subverted. And therefore, since about 1688, high Toryism has sort of become inherently more progressive or reflecting Whig and ultimately liberal tenets. And as a result, there is very little in the way of a pure reactionary tradition, other than looking back to the 17th century within the English strain of thought. So therefore, I do sort of adopt a more sort of continental view. I consider myself English. I am very much an English particularist. In this, I think both Carl and I will be in complete agreement. But I situate my English particularism within the context of a more sort of European universalist system of religion, of institutions, and of history. So with that being the basis for our discussion, I'll get into the main points we really want to cover in this this stream. before coming on, Panama had sent me a couple of points, and I've divided these into broad categories. One is autonomy, one is morality, one is politics, and one is universalism, and the final one is progress. But before I get into that, I've picked an author to discuss the issue of autonomy, liberty, human self-sovereignty, who I thought could bridge the gap between Panama and Karl, Eric von Kuhn-Held the Dean, a Catholic who was also a self-described ultra-liberal in that tradition. So if it's okay with both of you, I'll just read this short passage, and I think this could be a good basis for discussion. So please do bear with me.
Please go ahead.
Sorry, Panama.
I was saying, please go ahead. You said if that was all right with us. Yes, I'm quite a fan of Kuhn-Held the Dean.
As anybody with a real knowledge of Europe might expect, the term liberal in its political sense is of Spanish origin. It appears for the first time after 1812 in the Iberian Peninsula and was soon adopted by the French. Southerly, in the Quarterly Review, wrote in 1816 for the first time about the British liberals, and 10 years later we see Scott using the expression libéraux. This term was used for the radical wing of the Whigs, which is not quite identical with the connotation we attribute to this label. In the United States, a liberal has come to mean a person who welcomes change, and thus would not be adverse to embracing or fostering a totalitarian ideology. Thus, genuine liberals, for example, the late Oswald Garrison Villard, in order to distinguish themselves from communist sympathizers, like to call themselves old-fashioned liberals. On the European continent, the situation was not dissimilar. These liberals often engage in a veritable persecution of all those who preferred a different scope of views. Professor Carlton J.H. Hayes very adroitly called them sectarian liberals. The philosophical and psychological motives for the liberal position show a great variety. The driving force in Christian liberalism will be affection and generosity. Yet we also know of a liberalism derived from basic philosophical nihilism, which declares that truth is either a mere prejudice, a piece of intellectual arrogance, a sensory fraud, or that it is humanly unattainable outside the reach of faculty of reason. It is obvious that such a philosophy of despair, which we reject, does not necessarily result in a liberal attitude. It may wind up in its opposite, and the type of its evolution thus depend merely on personal preference or temperament. There is another possible motive which could be harmonized with the Christian position, namely the conviction that illiberalism is a bad strategy. And here he goes into the example of the Catholic example in particular, and the idea of forced conversions, i.e. forced baptism, and how officially the Catholic Church in 1818 tried to stamp out this process, yet it had become commonplace by the late Middle Ages and the early Renaissance. These changes of attitude, on the other hand, have nothing to do with the adamant insistence on the infallibility of the teaching of the Church in dogmatic matters. Today, the possibility of an honest, tragic conflict between conscience and truth is fully admitted. It was bad psychology, not bad philosophy, which imputed bad faith to every heretic or dissenter. In this connection, it must also be borne in the mind that true liberalism is hardly comparable with unlimited capitalism, and the example he uses here is the Manchester School. Property is also a means to freedom. Since private capitalism tends to concentrate property in fewer and fewer hands, it is from a genuinely liberal position or view only a lesser evil in comparison with state capitalism or socialism. For the truly liberal solution of the problem of production, we have to look to other prophets than Smith and Stalin. So I think that's quite a good introduction to the inherent friction within this terminology of liberalism, both the obvious contradictions. Obviously, he doesn't draw a distinction specifically between the English and the French tradition, as you have done, Karl. But first of all, he brings up the origin of the term liberalism. Then he goes into this idea of liberalism as bearing forth affection and generosity, or being essentially a source of political nihilism. Then he goes on to the question that if we have a body or institutional ideology which commits itself to be truthful, in this case it is the Catholic Church, what is the grounds for freedom of conscience within that system? And of course, he ends by talking about liberalism's relationship with property. So do either of you have any points you want to bear with regard to all of these points?
I'm happy to mention a few things if you're okay with that, Panama.
Absolutely.
I was not aware that the original use of the term liberalism as a political ideology was in 19th century Spain. I didn't know that. That's a very interesting thing I've learned, because as you were speaking, I was put in mind of a particular passage in Burke's Reflections where I can't remember exactly what it was, but he was essentially saying something like, "Well, I'm as liberal as the next man, but this is bonkers what you guys are trying to do." And you can see that this is not the musings of someone with a fully formed political ideology about a particular thing. This is someone who just recognizes that liberality as a concept is a virtue in a way, in many ways, and so it's not become the full spectrum of commitments that it becomes later on. And I think again, I hate using the term liberalism for it, because I don't think it's accurate, really, because the purpose of the Enlightenment is the supremacy of reason. It's to conquer nature in the pursuit of the relief of man's estate, as I understand it. And this isn't really what the English view of political freedom, political liberty was about, as Panama was putting it earlier. In fact, it's nothing to do with any of that. And so if liberalism is a crib of the English political traditions, then whatever came out of the French Revolution was something warped and monstrous that clearly failed to understand the purpose of the political project in its entirety.
I think perhaps I would just add on to that perhaps part of the reason for that is that the way that again I dislike to use the term, but the way that, because it's what I'm talking about, the way that liberalism in the English conception came about, it basically inherited a state which was already decentralized and it was already aristocratic, and it remained kind of spread out through various institutions and estates. Whereas what the French liberal system inherited was already an absolutist, quite autocratic, in fact, very autocratic state. So perhaps that is the issue there. You know, there's your divergence.
Can I push back on this slightly, because I've just actually done a lecture on this on French absolutism. I mean, it's wrong to think. I mean, I hate the word autocracy. I mean, autocracy within the historical context, of course, refers to Russia, but within absolutism, I mean, absolutism is. I mean, the most sort of articulate thinker on French absolutism is the Bishop of Meaux, Jean-Benin Bossuet. And he defines, again, absolutism in complete contrast to arbitrariness. And effectively, his conception of absolutism is a rather modern conception of how we view the state, in the sense that absolutism, as personified by the monarch, I am the state, essentially means that the monarch has the monopoly of the effective monopoly of the use of violence, which is essentially all, a term that we would all adopt as the definition of a state. And this is moving beyond feudalism, where the effective use of violence was decentralized. The king did not possess the absolute power in that regard. Instead, it was devolved to various feudal lords. However, within the system of French absolutism, there is this inherent friction between this idea of a national constitution based on this form of protections against arbitrariness, and again, this idea that that system failed. Therefore, we need to create a new system to cover up for the failures of the original feudal system. Within England, it's interesting because Parliament essentially conquered the monarchy. In France, it's the opposite case, where the monarchy essentially conquered Parliament. But because it didn't have a Parliament, because there wasn't a functioning Estates General until just before the French Revolution, and that definitely wasn't functional, and because other systems within France, such as the Paris Parlement, had all begun to break down, and the king had used essentially he wanted to use these parliaments just to ratify edicts. He didn't want them to become legislatures as we would know them now. But the effect of this meant that the king was forced into a position where he had to make constant compromises, because his legitimacy was always based on his own essentially the personality of the monarch rather than the success of the institutions. What happened in England, one can say successfully, one can say from a reactionary point of view rather disastrously, is that England was ultimately able to work out a system where Parliament and the monarchy were able to function together, and it involved basically the complete marginalization and isolation of the monarch. In France, it was essentially the opposite of that. But it's interesting to look at the 17th century, how they're both born out of these same basic struggles between aristocracy and monarchy and these ideas of a natural constitution. And I would say both the English example and the French examples were in a way departures from this idea. Again, I'm going to employ an orthodox idea here of symphonia. In the Orthodox case, it refers simply to the harmony between the church and the monarch. But in this case, I'm making a broader definition to mean harmony between the estates, the church. Of course, the church is one of the estates, and the monarch. If you have a central breach between these institutions, then, in my view, there is an inherent illegitimacy or friction within this political system. And of course, in England, that had to be resolved over time by allowing for a certain group of aristocrats, a Whig aristocracy, to dominate the political system and isolate the monarch throughout the course of the 18th century. And when that system began to unravel in the 19th century, it was instead progressed by parliamentary politics. So yes, that's my sort of.
Okay, I think that actually gives us an interesting framework to work with, actually, because if I can go back to Oakeshott's conception of the political crib of political traditions, I think that one of the reasons that liberalism didn't become what it became in France, in England, is because in many ways I think that, all John Locke was essentially doing was saying, well, look, rights are, and then he gave a list of the rights of Englishmen. And so essentially in England, he's merely telling people what they already know and what they already believe. So there's nothing radical about anything that Locke came out with. And so the Glorious Revolution feels, in I guess I'll say an aesthetic way, merely as a normal continuity of English political life. There's nothing about it that feels like a break from the past. And I don't know when you want to go into my little pedigree of English constitutionalism, but I've got a thing that I prepared, not specifically for this, but it's very handy for this, to talk about that. It was not something that was a radical breach from the past. And I think that this whole system, it works because of, I guess, what I haven't necessarily got the best terminology for all of this, but I'm gonna say the homely nature of England and the way that the English viewed their own island, viewed their own country. The political system, I think, not so, even still now to a certain extent, I think there's an unspoken assumption of goodwill that underpins it, that prevents the need for abstract certainties to be codified in rules and regulations. And I think this is where the English muddling through is particularly on show, because the assumption. Sorry,
can I just add to that? I do think that the English constitution, if we'll call it that, part of the reason that it was so lasting and so successful was because, as you say, the muddling through. It's because of the incoherence, in my opinion. That is, if you look at history, the most successful constitutions are the most incoherent ones, basically. The ones that you can't make real, the ones that are the most difficult to grasp holistically.
Yeah, sorry, if I can add to that. Bo and I, we do a series called Epochs on lotuses.com, which our good host has been gracious enough to appear on many times. And we did one on Solon, and Bo didn't grasp initially, like he being the historian, was looking at Solon's reforms of Athens and saying, well, this is all a bit vague, isn't it? But I saw it and instantly perceived what I think Solon was driving at here, which was, look, the point is, if I give you a hard and fast rule, this means that you are saying that everything is permissible up until the very final point. And what that means is it doesn't matter who you're hurting up until that last point. As long as you don't cross this one particular line, for whatever that line is, then any amount of damage done to the people in your way is actually totally valid and justifiable.
Mhm.
And whereas a system where you've got things far less clearly defined, and again, this sort of Solonic system was very much you're in it together, make compromises, have consideration for the people around you. The whole thing, as Aristotle would have put it, is meant to be underpinned with a goodwill. And that, I think, is what separates it from the sort of French the Rousseauian contract theory, is that the idea of goodwill is just totally absent. And all of this, I think, is presupposed in English constitutional history. It's just assumed that we've got a generally goodwill towards our fellow countrymen. Whereas if you are changing the nature of what it is to be a political citizen, and I've recently been performing a big deep dive on Rousseau, and I mean, at one point Rousseau essentially says anyone who breaks the law has attacked the social contract and is no longer a citizen, right? There's no way in English thought. The only way you could be something like that in English thought is if you were to betray your country to a foreign power, which is pretty drastic. And even then, it's not that you're not an Englishman; it's that you're a traitor. There's no way of like non-Englishing yourself in that sort of way, as far as I can see. And I think there's this tone and tenor that changes the way in which the mindset can be used for political gain. The English view being, well, try not to ruin everyone else around you because they're your countrymen and you should have some goodwill and positive sentiment towards them, compared to the sort of French social contract theory, which says, well, do whatever you can do and up until the very bounds of the law. Fuck them. What do you think?
I mean, on the whole, yeah, I'd agree with that. I'm kind of thinking. I mean, is like, so just out of curiosity, then. So like, where do you think this Englishness that seems to that sort of forms itself around these ideas and kind of drives them in a way that is good? Where do you see this as coming from primordially, if you will? Like, what is the kind of principle? Like, where is the soul of this Englishness coming from?
That's a really good question that I think is lost in the mists of time. I guess this is a good time to go through my little pedigree, right? And so basically, I just went through and read a bunch of old texts from English constitutional history and like legal events, just to see not what the letter of the law was, but what the spirit of the thing was for. How they were viewing it. And I guess the first, I'll start from one of the most recent and go backwards. So I was reading Burke's Reflections, which started me on this whole train of thought. And one of the fascinating things about this is that he's responding to a Dr. Richard Price, who is an Englishman spouting French revolutionary ideals. And Burke goes away from this speech at the Old Jewry and is like, no, this is nonsense. And he begins by saying, well, look, the petition of right, the 1688 English Bill of Rights, he's totally misrepresenting it. It doesn't allow us to cashier on monarchs. It doesn't allow this, that, and the other. You're making this up, and I don't know why. And then he goes into his big, grand view of the sort of continuum of civilization, the Great Chain. But the thing that I found most interesting about Burke is that it's totally assumed, where it's not outright explicitly stated, that everything that the English have is built as a hereditary right. It's passed down from generation to generation.
That's right.
Absolutely. And your birthright as an Englishman, this, and it's not just as an individual though, it's in the institutions, the wisdom that accumulates in the institutions. And he outright states that it's about the good things that we have are the product of many hands. Each man's private stock of wisdom is actually very small in the English view, whereas the institution is the work of many, many hands, all adding a brick to the tower or whatever it is that we're building. And this means that we're the inheritors of something that we don't necessarily actually rationally understand, but we can see the positive effects of it. And so the assumption is that this comes from long ago. And so I went to the English Bill of Rights, and this is a phrase that you find all the way through almost all of these. From this particular translation, they say This is for the vindicating and asserting of their ancient rights and liberties, and therefore they declare whatever they declare. And then you can go to the Petition of Rights, that was 1689, then again 1628, and they're petitioning the king, I assume, and say, so the other good laws and statutes of your realm, your subjects have inherited this freedom. And you get this same thing where it's over and over and over. And you can go back to like the provisions of Westminster, and it's like, well, these are customarily done. And so the terms, and in the Magna Carta even, ancient rights and customs, or ancient liberties and customs. And then you can go back further before the Norman Conquest and find from the laws of King Alfred, just a quick quote here, then I, King Alfred, just gathered them together and ordered many to be written down that our forefathers had observed. I dared not presume to set down in writing many of my own, since it was unknown to me what would please those who should come after us. And then I think you can go back even further into Tacitus's Germania, and you see that you've got the kind of he literally says, they choose their kings by birth, their generals for merit. These kings have not the unlimited or arbitrary power. If they're energetic, if they're conspicuous, and the fact they're friendly, because they are admired. And so you get back to this sort of what Robert Conquest calls sort of Anglo-Saxons in the woods. And I think this is the spirit that imbues all of English political history, is that at some time in the distant past, we were just getting along. We were just happy and getting along in whatever we were doing. And then something came along, upset the apple cart, whether it's the Viking invasions, the Norman conquest, whatever it is. And essentially the spirit of all English political life from, I don't know which way to categorize it, but it's to get back to the state where things are kind of run properly. Obviously the king shouldn't be interfering with us. Obviously we shouldn't be tyrannizing each other. Obviously I should be considerate of my neighbors. And so it's a kind of, the whole thing is bound together in a relational matrix with one another, with the powers that be, and the past and the present and the future. And this, I think, imbues all of English history. And you can go to like Peel's laws of policing. I mean, it seems ludicrous that the British police aren't armed, except I think that almost every Englishman kind of knows, yeah, you kind of got to cooperate with the police. I mean, obviously, but then you're not being tyrannized by some foreign, arbitrary law that's been handed down by a divine or, by a kingly authority. You've got the common law, which is on your side, and it's a discovered law. It's one of those, the whole process is like this slow evolutionary thing that's underpinned by good faith. And I think that's what sets England apart, and why England had what I guess the people, the Continentals, would have called liberty, and that's what I think that Rousseau was jealous of.
Could I perhaps theorize, maybe? I mean, in contrast to continental Europe, and I agree essentially with what you. I mean, I admire these institutions and this kind of longevity that England has. I mean, there's a line by Nicolas Gomez that is. Basically, we don't admire basically it's not that a good constitution lasts. It's that it's good because it lasts. If that makes sense. You don't try and pen something to last. It lasts. Therefore, you admire it in a sense. But my thought is that, well, unlike most of the rest of Europe, England and the British Isles are cut off. Basically, it's an island, right? Yes. And I think what this allows is that you almost have a kind of vacuum in which you can develop your own internal structures without really, obviously there are many invasions, but really having to worry about external pressure. It isn't like you're being constantly put under a foreign king, or you're being forced to wage wars on your borders all the time.
Totally.
For a lot of English history. And I think this is really what I think, to answer my earlier point perhaps, is this is perhaps why England seems so different in that sense, because they have this freedom to kind of look upon themselves inwardly and construct, as opposed to having to constantly kind of extricate themselves in outward areas that then cause weakness internally, I think. And whenever there is a major invasion of England, even if it's not successful, it's still enormous, as you say. It can completely redefine the entire system of the way the country works.
I think that your characterization is exactly spot on, and I've thought about this because I lived in Germany for 8 years over my life, and I've thought about this to a great extent, particularly about the Germans, because there is definitely this sentiment that bubbles under the surface of German life.
Yeah,
right?
because they're trapped there, right? They're trapped in the middle of Europe.
But it's being oppressed by Prussianism, I think. And right. It's obvious, isn't it? When you think about it. But there's the kind of like Bavarianism, like the sort of, and
well, I have to just come in here because it's interesting you bring this up, because Bavaria and a lot of the other Catholic areas of Germany are some of. I mean, I know I don't want to admit to having ideals, although we all do, but it's one of my ideal kind of states as it was before the Prussian age, because it's this kind of very decentralized, rural, aristocratic kingdom that is loyal to the Catholic Church, which is a power way beyond the mountains. That's where the term ultramontane comes from. It's literally loyal to a king far away beyond the mountains. And I think that, I mentioned the thing about Germany being kind of trapped there in the middle of Europe. The Prussian domination of Germany, I think, was basically a net negative in the long run, because it meant that you had this kind of constant, almost paranoid militarism that had to kind of constantly be sort of pushing towards this entropy of expanding and expanding and expanding its borders to try and ward off these threats that it was constantly stuck between. You got, France and the West on one side, and you got the Russians and the Poles on the other. Do you mind
if I just jump back in again? Because I just to finish off my thought before we carry on, because this is the thing. I've long thought this about Germany, and I'm absolutely sure it is purely geography that gave England this circumstance. Now, what the English did. What the English do with that is a large part of the character of the people, and I think that there is more virtue in the slow-witted gut intuitions of the English than a lot of, especially progressives, are willing to concede. They tend to hate it, but the thing is, it tends to be right and it tends to win, and this is something they loathe. And so I'm not it's not purely about the geography, but I really do think the geography plays a huge role in this.
I would agree. I mean that there isn't that constant pressure, I don't think. To me, I would characterize England prior to the industrial age as basically a nation of hobbits, literally. And because there's a kind of relaxed, separated atmosphere, because you're not constantly being pressured by this frontier and that frontier, and what constantly having to make alliances and wage wars, and the English, they have this whole kind of slow, sort of almost gentlemanly conception of war, because they can fight when they choose, in a sense. If they want to be involved in a war, it's up to them. They're not really being forced to, outside of some very major exceptions, of course.
Interestingly, the Norman monarchy is also one of the best things I think that's ever happened to England.
Really. Now I didn't think you were going to say that.
Well, hang on. Let me qualify.
It's going to be interesting.
I think that much of English constitutional history since the Norman invasion has been about reining in the monarchy, right? Because obviously they came across with French ideas of what kingship was, and the English had very different ideas of what the proper role of a king is. But the English definitely are monarchists of their own fashion, and they view the monarch as kind of like a Pokemon. Like, I'm not even joking.
You hear every day, is it?
No, but it like this is a modernist, like this is what modern people can, like, literally, but the thing is, the king has got lots of duties and obligations. But in many ways, the king, if you go back and read just any of the Robin Hood myths, the king is the hero, really, and it's the bad aristocrats, the bad middle managers. The sheriff, the clergy, these people who on a daily basis are oppressing you, and then you petition the king, and the king loves his people. That's the point of it.
This is a theme that you find quite universally in kind of monarchical loving societies. This idea that the monarch is always good. It's the people in between you and him that are the ones that you've got to worry about.
On. It's not that the monarch is always good. Sometimes you get bad monarchs like King John. There's a certain expected behavior of the monarch and a certain goodwill and intention.
I will rephrase that as the institution is good, perhaps, as opposed to the personal.
The institution, as with much of things in England, goes largely unquestioned as long as it functions to a reasonable degree. And so if it's lasted for a long time, which it has, and the monarch seems to be okay and he's not tyrannizing me, which most of the time he's not, then the institution is generally considered to be fine. But there's a romance in this, and this is why when Tolkien is saying, well, I'm creating a mythology for England, well, it's not a surprise that the last book is called The Return of the King.
Yeah, exactly.
It very much echoes the Richard and John saga, and this is embedded in the Robin Hood myths. When Richard returns, everything is fixed.
Something I want to ask you on this point, basically. Now, one of the principles that I hold most dear as a reactionary is this idea of good and natural hierarchy in all things, essentially. And what a lot of modern, quote, liberals will say is, no hierarchy, everybody has to be equal. But to me, that is the opposite of liberty. The idea to me that hierarchy is the protector and the progenitor of liberty, because once you have your proper place in it, then you have a great deal more liberty than if you're forced into something else, basically.
So I've thought about this a lot because I think this is why that when the French decided, right, okay, we're going to try and adapt Englishism. They came up with liberty, equality, fraternity. And if you think about it, all of those things are essentially the opposite of each other.
Yeah, it's catastrophic.
Yes, absolutely. And none of them can really coexist if they're designed to coexist. But for some reason in England, they did. And we say, England was hardly a society of equals. But, there is a kind of moral equality that underpins the entire system. And this is very interestingly, there's a one particular tale called A Guest of Robin Hood, and in this story, King Richard goes and sneaks into Robin Hood's camp in disguise.
I think I remember it.
And allows himself to be treated just like any other yeoman. And that one of the morals of the story is that this was right. That there is genuine goodness in this, of the king humbling himself and showing respect to the yeoman in their proper place. So it's not that there's no hierarchy. Like Robin Hood is in charge.
Oh, it's a very clear hierarchy, isn't it? The hierarchy is never really questioned or shown to be bad, is it?
But it's not hierarchy as I think someone who is outside of these circles would hear the word, right? They would hear like racial aristocracy or something like that. Because I mean, when the king, when Robin, he sets the rules. He says, well, we're going to shoot the target, and if you're further than 3 fingers away from the target, then you get a slap around the head and you get your bow taken away. And unbelievably, on this one day, everyone's a terrible shot. All of the merry men, none of them hit the target. They all get the slap around the head and get their bows taken away. And then Robin takes his shot, misses the target miraculously, gets a slap around the head by the king and gets his bow taken away. But the king is just a yeoman as far as they're concerned. But then it's the king's turn. He takes his shot, he misses, and then he gets slapped around the head and gets his bow taken away. And so there's this kind of moral equality in it, where it's like, no, the rule was the rule. You set the rule and we all agreed to the rule, and now you're going to play by that rule. And so where no one's questioning the legitimacy of the king or even the legitimacy of Robin Hood himself as the leader of a gang of outlaws, but the rule is the rule, and it's not fair if you get to play by a rule that you set that everyone else has to play by and you don't also have to play by. And
there's that English expectation of fairness, which I think goes back to the kind of very early medieval days where it seemed to kind of spring up as an iron law.
Honestly, I think it goes back really, really far. Like, I think it goes back further than that. I think it's just most notable, like, because of the Normans being unfair, that this comes to the fore. But I do think this is I think it's been a presupposition of the whole thing. And I did some studying on Alfred the Great, and I just found Alfred's philosophy and worldview is, oh God, the Vikings have invaded. We must have offended God. it's us. We are the ones responsible for bringing this terrible thing down on us. And he's like, right, so what am I going to do?
It's an anti-arrogant humbleness, isn't it?
Okay, yeah, it's very, very humble. And so
dare I say, very Christian.
Oh, it is completely Christian, obviously. And so Alfred decides the problem is that the English can't read the Bible, and so he translates the Bible into Anglo-Saxon in the 9th century, and then sends out copies of this across the country. He says, no, look, get reading this. We need to be good Christians, so God won't keep sending these things on us. And in the meantime, I'm going to raise an army and fight the Vikings. And it's just like, that is just such a, like, that's a totally, like, that's the concept of moral equality there, right? It's like, he's not like, oh, well, we should have this, like, and I hate to point fingers at the Catholics here, but there's definitely an element of exclusiveness with the priesthood in the Catholic Church, right? And Alfred goes completely against that grain, like 1,000 years before the printing press, or 800 years before the printing press. So it's just strange how, like, this view of what it is to be an Englishman and like in this tribe is, it's got a kind of wholesomeness about it that I don't know, what to really say other than I have a genuine love for it.
Well, I mean,
sorry.
Oh, sorry, go on.
I've kept quiet for a very long time. I noticed some people in the chat. Just a couple of things. I have to sort of go all the way back. Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt your tangent. But going back to this notion of constitutionalism, yes, I think we all sort of appreciate the fact that the best constitutions are uncodified, or that they have an aspect which is always trying to remember some form of earlier precedent to keep that chain, which is tradition. Tradition literally means in Latin to pass on. But of course, there is a caveat to that. There is a term coming out of the purges of Diocletian called traditores, to give over or to betray. So I'm very wary when I do encounter historical documents which come back to this notion of liberalism, because it's always about claiming legitimacy for an action. But of course, there is added to Burke what I find rather frustrating about him, because I mean, the fundamental notion of Burke's political philosophy, the idea of a system of government for the dead, for the living, and for those who are yet to come, is fundamentally, we would all agree, I believe, with that principle. But this faith in institutions and this faith in the idea of continuity isn't enough. There needs to be principles behind it. You've already sort of alluded to, this aspect of remembering. Well, of course, this another aspect of this is going back to God. And if you look at, I mean, you've also talked about geographic determinism regarding history. I think that sort of triggered me a little bit. I
was surprised you didn't come in when we were saying that.
Yes. Especially with regards to Germany, because the remarkable thing about England is that England obviously is a nation. England was founded as a nation of conquerors. And when we talk about the unification of England under Athelstan, and of course beginning with Alfred the Great and the Kingdom of Wessex, this is in opposition to a foreign invader. So the formation of a unitary state in the form of England, which we see in the 10th century, was born of invasion. It wasn't this political system which was allowed essentially to operate in isolation. And this is not only the case when we see the England's constant sort of warring relationship with the Celtic tribes that were there before, but it's also the case with other foreign invaders. So when we look at 1066, what was significant about 1066 is that, well, before then, so we're talking the period from 927 until 1066, the English monarchy was constantly assailed by foreign threats. Including Denmark. At one point, the Danish actually put their own dynasty, and of course, you'll all probably be aware of King Canute. But coming after that, when looking at the Norman conquest in particular, the Norman conquest, in my view, was an interruption of this form of English continuity, in the sense that we have, I would say, in 1066, one of the most absolutist, centralized, and despotic states imaginable within the medieval context. France, by contrast, was completely decentralized and had only just sort of ushered in the Capetian dynasty. I believe around the same time, so this is 1066, the actual royal domain of the French kings was at its smallest ever in its history, whereas the Norman Duke, who was now the King of England, was comparatively far more powerful than the King of France, despite the fact that the King of France, again, was supposed to be overlord, liege to a much greater territory. So what we see, I mean, we're talking about this idea of the Norman conquest being good for England. Well, it also involved England in almost perpetual conflict for the next 500 years, because obviously we have Normandy, which needs to be defended from the encroachment of not only the French monarch, but various other nobles. Then we have the marriage between Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine, which massively expands the English provinces in France. We have the ongoing conflicts between Wales. In fact, the conflict between the Welsh and the English is so ferocious that there is an entire segment essentially forming the Midlands and the east of Wales, which become the Welsh Marches. And at one point, the Irish are conquered. But again, it's the same in the north. It's the same in the north with the Scottish marches. This idea of sort of constant warfare, and again, this isn't necessarily due to national self-perpetuation. The fact that England has been conquered by a foreign dynasty means that there are constant conflicts around the idea of Dieu mon droit. That is the basis of the royal claim. By my right, I have a right to France, so I'm going to prosecute these conflicts. So this is the rallying cry of the English, really, arguably, up until Henry VIII, who was really the last king to seriously take an active interest in this claim of France. So what is remarkable is we see this overthrow of the English institutions. So take one in particular institution like the Witenagemot and the idea of an elected monarchy. All of this is done away with the Normans, and we have ushered in a form of dynastic rule. That again holds true during the life of William the Conqueror, and to establish his rule, obviously buildings and fortifications are essential to rule. He imports Norman stone, transforms the old English wooden castle with stone castles dotted throughout England as a literal sign of Norman imperialism. But when we come to Henry I, Henry I is perhaps the first king who really begins to contend with this idea of limitations on his power, and this is symbolized by the coronation oath. And this is why I have a slightly different conception. I don't believe that there is a conception of English constitutionalism that can really do without monarchy, because and again, this is the idea of divine right of kings is technically implicit in the fact that the king, as the vice regent of God, or as again a lord, as representative of the king, is invested with a form of essentially direct responsibility to ensure the right governance of a kingdom on behalf of a sacred power. In this case, we're talking about the Christian God. And this is symbolized in the coronation oath. And many aspects of the coronation oath are associated with the protection specifically of various institutions, the estates, the nobility, etc. And this is why Magna Carta is less significant than it originally appears.
Yeah.
Because Magna Carta is a reiteration of that. However, the 1215 Magna Carta is based on a much more radical idea of the right of the nobility to overthrow the government, which you can say is included somewhat in John Locke's idea of the right to revolutions, which is formed basis of the of natural law and the social contract. But this is done away with. This is done away with in the Magna Carta. It doesn't hold any weight, even though there are advocates of the barons who pushed this idea throughout the 13th century. The first king, who I would say really begins to harmonize this idea of the synthesis of the estates, parliament, even the conception of parliament as we know today, the model parliament, and effective royal monarchy, is Edward I. I think in that case, again, it takes 200 years to arrive at Edward I as a king who is actually effective in terms of being an executive ruler, who takes his oath seriously and is again beholden to this idea of the estates. But the estates aren't there to hold the king accountable in some sort of modern conception. The estates are there to augment and facilitate advice towards the king, to represent the estates, to represent the various baronies, to represent the towns, to represent the church in particular, so that the king can more effectively prosecute wars and continue a system of temporal rule. So this is all very sort of complicated, and I hate these. I don't like these sort of grand sort of generalizations, because when we look at the grand sort of constitutional narrative of English history, at many points there was this constant conflict going on between monarchy and and Parliament, and what essentially we arrive at in the 17th century, which is why this is so significant, is that that relationship is completely broken down. It breaks down during the reign of James I, who begins to advocate a more, again, a form of absolutism, which is more in line with the idea that the king is paternal, the king is following in the footsteps of biblical monarchy. So there is an inherent absolutism baked into his conception, which doesn't have to pay heed to these ideas of, again, this is representational government in the ancient sense, not in the modern sense. The idea that the estates are there to facilitate the king's rule. Of course, James VI and James I, as Nathan Hood has just reminded me, James VI of Scotland. But this breaks down during the reign also of Charles I. And of course, Charles I has to literally fight the parliamentarians, and he is defeated twice in that conflict, and his head is removed. Parliament cannot form a government, so it instead installs a military dictatorship under Cromwell. But these arguments, they're not solved with the Restoration. All of this comes back. With the conflicts under the reign of Charles II and James II. Instead, the Roundheads and the Cavaliers have evolved into Whigs and into Tories. So what I see in the course of English history isn't this, unbroken tradition. What I see is this constant warfare, constant embattlement between these various institutions, again, over a conception of liberty, and whether the source of legitimacy in the state emanates from the monarch, or it emanates from, again, some conception of natural liberty or natural law. And both of these ideas at this time are baked into this idea of, again, Christianity and the idea that God is ultimately sovereign. And of course, that very much forms a part of Oliver Cromwell's own sort of political conception. But what we arrive at with 1688 is, again, the betrayal of the High Tories and the invitation of William the Conqueror. Not only is it a radical departure in terms of how Britain views itself in relation to the other countries of Europe, it's basically a diplomatic revolution, but it's a political revolution in the sense that the Parliament has usurped one monarch. It has denied the rightful position of another monarch. This is the would-be James III, the old pretender. It has installed a foreign monarch, and thereafter Parliament has determined the right of succession and determined the position of the Church. And this is another conflict we need to look into, which is, what is the status of the Church of England? If you look at it with someone like Henry VIII, the Reformation, some people just put it down to aspects like, Henry VIII wanted to divorce his wife. No, there was something much more sincere than that going on, albeit you can argue that was mainly a pretext. The idea that there is a national church and the papacy, or this ultramontane, ultramonetism, the idea of the prerogatives of the Pope is very important here, has robbed the English of this sense of particularism, of the institutional rights of the church. So at one point, the king is an advocate for the rights of the local church. On the one hand, like James II, he is seen as the opponent of that. So when we're looking at this conception of liberty, we have to look at it through the view of the institutions that make up these nations, that rule these nations, and understand how, adopting the Burkean position, the problem for me with the reflections of the revolution in France is that there is, within his condemnation of 1789 to 1793, 1794, there is a complete defense of the Glorious Revolution as something which is based on these, institutional continuity. But as I just mentioned, that was an incredibly controversial aspect at the time, because it was dependent on the deposition of an anointed sovereign, the banning of another sovereign from becoming king, and the fact that Parliament had imposed an act of succession which forbade the rightful dynas effectively becoming king. So built into this idea of tradition is what you can say, this cherry-picked view of continuity. And if you continue down this line of everything is echoing this idea of the ancient liberty of the English people, ultimately this becomes less an act of remembering than it becomes an act of invention. And the constitutionalism sort of overrides this acting principle or spirit of Englishness, as we're talking particularly about the example in England. And as we see during the 19th century, these institutions become inherently progressive. And it's done because there is a definite political incentive within the camps, whether they be Whig, Liberal, Tory, Conservative, to expand the franchise. And once you've expanded the franchise, built again on that presupposition that everything is technically being done within the confines of our ancient constitution, then you have fundamentally changed the notion of what it means, what the English state is, where the monarchy is essentially irrelevant. It simply forms a functional role. And we have entered into a situation with democracy. And going back to Eric Kuhn-Held, here he believes that liberalism itself, as you would identify, Carl, and also this idea of absolute liberalism, classical liberalism, has been made redundant because the state is no longer acting in accordance with an act of remembering or hearkening back to English liberty. Instead, it is by proxy adopted this Rousseauian conception of the national will of democracy, that the will of the people, or the will of the present, I would rather say, because to refer to it as democracy in our current instance is almost completely ludicrous. This idea of constant progress, and anyone who is against progress needs to be evicted from society. You can say that Rousseauianism actually conquered this country, and I think it is based on this idea of misinterpretation and subversion, which is also baked into the very word of tradition, which is to pass on or to concede, to betray, going back to the original definition in the Roman Empire. So yes, that's just my comments for England. I think I'm going to stop for Germany. I'm not going to let you comment on that.
Can I push back on some of that slightly? Not obviously your understanding of the historical events, but perhaps maybe the way I was characterizing it wasn't clear enough and allowed the misconception of what I think I was trying to say from what you took from it. None of what I was saying, I think, is conscious. None of what I think I was trying to put across was something that I think that the people involved had designs on achieving. I think these are unconscious, presupposed goods that were embedded in.
Yes, I completely agree with you. I completely agree with you. What I'm trying to emphasize here, I'm trying to give historical context to these ideas, more broader ideas. But I really want to emphasize that what you're outlining here, I have virtually no disagreement with. It's in terms of really ensuring that that is realized that I mainly have a concern with the realization of your principles as opposed to the course of English history.
Well, I'm not speaking as a doctrinaire liberal. I don't even know if I mean I am a liberal in like the most broad sense of the term. Like absolutely, if I were to enter into a political discussion, that would be how I would identify myself. And if someone said, okay, well, why is liberalism a good thing? I'd give a fairly common answer that almost anyone else could give. But I don't really consider myself to be much of an ideologist anymore. I'm not trying to use a set of ideas to advance a particular position. I'm trying more now to understand things. The reason I framed things as I did, it was not to imply there was no disagreement along the way, or wars in the context of arriving at what the resolution would be or anything like this. I'm not trying to suggest it's not a bumpy ride, and I 100% endorse the idea that we have been subverted by Rousseau. That's obviously true in my opinion. But what I think I'm trying to say really is like the kind of, I don't want to use the word innocence, but the unconscious, uncritical, in the moment thought isn't one of progress for progress's sake or anything like this. If anything, I actually view the path to English liberalism as paved with a desperate attempt to actually get back to something that the English themselves believed they had before the Normans. And whether this is true or not, it is irrelevant, really. It's more, this was just the spirit of why they were doing things. And I realize that it makes it a broad narrative that is undetailed in many places, and it's very true critique. But I do think there is some truth to what I'm saying there. And I do think this spirit of the thing informs much of the attitude towards future events. And it's not that I'm not even saying that it didn't set the stage for modern progressivism or anything like that, because I think there's actually a fairly strong argument that maybe it did, but I don't think that was ever its intention. And I think the idea of, say, removing God from any of these considerations is definitely not what they were aiming for. Like, it was never anyone's intention. I think it had to come from somewhere else. In fact, I mean, this is one of the things that I think is the big flaw with Locke, because you had a chap called Berkeley who just came out and said, Locke, what you are doing by codifying this is setting the stage for you. What you are doing for saying, look, there's a world that operates independent of God, is to say that God is actually not necessary, and you're going to create atheism, and you're going to have us arrive in a position where everyone's an atheist because God no longer is necessary. And Locke himself said, well, okay, we'll just make atheism illegal. That should be illegal. But he also described himself as an under-laborer for what would come next. Obviously, he didn't know what would come next. But I think the problem with Locke is actually he had a foot in both camps. And I really think this is most exemplified by the way his conception of human nature. So you've got Hobbes's man is basically bad. Rousseau's man is essentially good. And Locke's compromise was, well, most men are bad, but some are good. It's like, it's not. It's a very unsatisfying thing, and he is a bridge between the sort of rough, cynical, like English view and the idealistic utopian French view. And so I'm not saying there's no responsibility there. I'm not saying there's no continuity, like descent or ancestry of ideas or anything like that. I'm thinking more of a pre-theoretical way, that the procession of the English view of their own country has gone. And like I said, it's not to say there hasn't been a great deal of contestation or anything like that. What do you think?
No, I think it's more interesting than that. I think this idea, what I'm trying to explain, isn't really in contradiction with what your clarification there. Rather, that we are seeing the interplay of all of these different variations of what it means to have English liberty. I mean, I've even noticed that there are some advocates that the Catholic Church wasn't even brought in until 1066, and papal authority wasn't confirmed until the reign of John I. So there always, I don't sort of give those credence, but there's always this idea that there is some form of Englishness, this English liberty espoused and again advocated by some institutions, and it's always often defined in opposition to some form of again foreign intervening authority, which again illustrates many of these elements. I think what I find so frustrating about 1688 in particular and Magna Carta is that both of them were composed in the framework of permitting some form of foreign invasion. When it comes to Magna Carta, it is the invasion of the Dauphin Louis, and with the Glorious Revolution, it is the invasion of the Dutch. And of course, for the Dutch, essentially, the Dutch came in completely rededicated our foreign policy. I mean, obviously, you don't have to disagree or agree with them, because they obviously took a very anti-French policy after 1688. But up until then, our policy towards France had been that of allies, or sometimes intervening to support the Huguenots, but invariably we supported the French often against the Spanish. So it was in both senses these great sort of changes which sort of underwent with these reforms, Magna Carta and the Glorious Revolution. Again, despite the fact that there is an aspect to avoiding foreign intervening, these are all, the idea of foreign intervention is also a component of this. I think in that sense, the only sort of thing which you can say is lacking this idea of foreign intervention is the English Reformation. That and the fact that we also didn't adopt Lutheranism. So it wasn't just the fact that we weren't being compelled to do this by a foreign power, but we weren't also adopting a foreign religion in the form of German Protestantism into the country either. Rather, it was a form of Anglicanism in this regard is completely sort of theologically distinct from all of these facets. But with regards to whether this makes England exceptional, I mean, what I'm dumbfounded by when I look at European history, because I'm more of a European historian than I am an English historian. Most of what I know from English history is indirect. Is how all of these things are borne out continentally, or there is some sort of comparison. I mean, just bring in the Netherlands, for example, because obviously the Netherlands has a very close relationship. But even before 1688, what I find remarkable about England is that we talked about this idea of, the hobbits essentially, and the particularism of the English countryside. But what sort of demarcates England as being quite exceptional is the fact it was a state that centralized very early compared to many other European states. So when you look at somewhere like Germany or the Netherlands, they have this, not only do they have this tradition of localism, but they have these traditions of local independence, autonomy. And of course, this is also the same with Italy. And all of these countries have faced constant foreign intervention. So that's why I push back on this idea of England essentially being an island and therefore allowed to adopt this this form of a political system in the absence of foreign intervention. If anything, foreign intervention often galvanizes these localistic and particularistic movements. And of course, when looking at the reign of Philip II of Spain over the Netherlands, much of the framing was done as advocating for the particular rights and liberties of Dutchmen, harkening back to an earlier principle, which was the Dutch Magna Carta. It was called Magna Carta, the great privilege, which was given some 100 years before, I think, around the year 1478. So there are instances of this which you can draw, this spirit of, again, independence, this not wanting to be dominated by a foreign power, which can inform many aspects of political history. I mean, just looking to Germany, what's so fascinating about Germany is that Germany never really adopted a sense of national cohesion in the way that England did. And even today, Germany is still a federal state. I know people who identify themselves as, say, for example, being Bavarian before they're being German. And what I find, and again, when I was going over the 30 Years' War, what I really wanted to emphasize is that the Germans have this own conception of liberty. And they have their own versions of Magna Carta, of the great privileges. And the two instances which I gave was going back to this idea of the Golden Bull of 1356, which confirmed that the various lords of the realm had the right essentially to their own territories and the indivisibility of those territories, free from the inveigling of the emperor. And in 1556, with Augsburg, this is extended to the idea that the rulers are allowed to determine their own religions in their own territory as well. And this is, of course, baked into this idea of German liberty. This idea of Prussianism only sort of comes from a local aspect of Germany. I mean, when talking about like Prussian expansionism, it should be noted that, Frederick II, who sort of ushers in this period of Prussian expansionism, didn't conquer very much. He conquered one key province, Silesia, and it was a political ploy against his main adversary, the Austrians. And the rest of the territories he acquired was through diplomacy, diplomacy with the other major powers being Russia and the Austrian Empire. When we look at the greatest sort of period of Prussian expansion, it's in the case of German unification. So there is that, unsettling notion of Prussian domineering influence over Germany, and that was the intention. I've always contended that German unification in the 19th century was a form of Prussian conquest over Germany rather than genuine German unification. So there's an argument to be made there. But even as I'm assuming that some of you may have caught some of my my origins of World War I on the Lotus Eaters, but even in that, I don't sort of give aspects such as German militarism this this sort of predestined idea inherited in German militarism, which is going to lead to expansionism and conquest. I mean, if you look at the basic idea of this, which is the idea of the service nobility, the precedence of the Junker, the civility of the army to the state, this again is a key aspect of absolutism. And you don't just find that in Prussia either. I mean, my personal interpretation of this, which I'm going to go into in several weeks' time, is that idea of absolutism associated with the service nobility and an expansive army is again an import, and it's an import from France, which did it first. So what I'm trying to explain is that I find this remarkable interconnectivity when looking at European history, and I can't help but feel, again, in the absence today of a strong English identity, but be drawn to various aspects of European history. And of course, for me, the issue is, relaying this back to 1688 and relaying this back to the Reformation, is that I also happen to be a Catholic. So I have this conception of, church authority. But even then, it's not as simple as the Pope is kicked out, therefore I need to go with the Pope. No, if you look at someone like Thomas More, who had this very intricate conception of loyalty to the king and loyalty to the Pope, he remained loyal to his king over the Pope right up until the end, when he essentially had been found guilty with no real evidence brought against him. Only then, when the king had orchestrated this kangaroo court to burn him, to execute him, did he come out with his pro-papist leanings. So I think this is something important to note, is that, when I refer to myself as a Catholic, I am very much wedded to this idea of Englishness. And again, what I'm trying to do is sort of reconcile these these various elements together. And I have a lot of sympathy for Anglicanism as well, because, as again, my viewers will certainly know, I'm very much an advocate of Ghibellinism, which is this idea that the church and the state, the church is not the sun and the moon, as advocated by Innocent III. The church is not the radiating authority which gives life to everything else. Rather, the church is in control of matters spiritual, and the government, the king, or the emperor, is in charge of matters temporal. So in this respect, I can understand Anglicanism. The difficulty is with me is that it makes a complete break with the Pope, and therefore with the theological connection to Europe. And again, as Panama Hat has alluded to, this idea of the Christian soul of Europe, and connecting this back to something which binds us all together. Different languages, different regional histories, different kings, yet this is all bound in some sort of ideological conception. And what I'll go back to is Christianity as it existed pre-1517. But even saying that, I'm not going to write off, obviously, Ryan Turnipseed has appeared on the channel quite a lot of times, and I'm not going to write off aspects such as pietist Lutheranism, high church Lutheranism as well. I think all of these things can be sort of attempted to be reconciled with. So what I'm really underlying here is that I find it very difficult to buy into this idea of English exceptionalism, because I believe part of it is actually baked into the English consciousness post-French Revolution. And when I look at European history, I look at it in the round, I look at it in total, I look at it from the beginning of English history. The beginning of English history isn't here. The beginning of our history is in Germany, as you bring this back to Tacitus and Germania, the idea of the local tribal societies, of the things, of these tribal councils organizing in opposition to the Roman invasion. And this is then brought over into England and forms the basis of English identity. So what I'm trying to emphasize is that I'm trying to reconcile with notions of English identity as being continental, but also to reconcile this with the fact that England post 1688 has essentially no hard right. Every sort of aspect of the right has been politically emaciated, or it has been subverted ever since. And whether this plays into this idea of, the spirit of English liberalism, again, I think my fundamental philosophy is fundamentally liberal, in the sense that I believe that, the conscience, the idea that, Elizabeth's idea that one should not create windows into men's souls is crucial to understanding any sort of Christian conception of power, politics, and liberty. And maybe we can finally go into now the idea of how private property relates to this. But I think, yes, just in terms, that is my response to the points that have been made here.
So what I find the use of the term English exceptionalism interesting, because I wouldn't call it exceptionalism, because that implies superiority, and I don't think that's. I mean, there is definitely, especially in modern times, an attitude that there is something a bit superior compared to the rest of the continentals. But I don't think that's really what I'm getting at. I think it's more parochialism. There's a kind of attitude where it's there's an English way of doing things, and it's just not the foreign way. And the English church is just our church. It's just ours, and it's just not yours or the foreigners, theirs. And it's not as xenophobic as it sounds. It's not as disconnected as it sounds either, but I do think, and I'm not even saying it's not since the French Revolution either, because I mean maybe there's a way of viewing this as the kind of excessive English parochialism is based on this, subconscious desire to stop the foreigners from stealing what's ours or something like this. Who knows? I don't know how to frame it. It's there's definitely a form of insularness to the English that I think isn't quite found elsewhere. And it's not to say that everything that happened in England was unique, or that it was perfect, or that none of the foreigners got anything right, or anything like this. But I do think there is something there that I'm possibly describing poorly.
No, it's fair. I think it's just the way I view things, Carl. I think I'm always, I have, I don't want to give myself, really more credit than I want to, but I sort of think comparatively. So I tend to draw comparisons with everything, and of course, transnational comparisons.
Mm-hmm.
So again, what I've found sort of remarkable, going over this recent lecture I did over French absolutism, is that in 1681, at the peak of his power, Louis XIV tried to effect something that was very similar to what Henry VIII was trying to do, in that he wanted to assert that within France, and again, even within the Catholic understanding, the French church is considered the eldest daughter of the church. It is basically considered, it has, again, this idea of exceptionalism baked into it, albeit as part of this Catholic conception. It's still part of the Catholic Church, and there's even a word for it, Galicanism. And again, you can understand the relationship between Galicanism and Anglicanism. And as part of this conception, Louis XIV wanted complete unity within France, but he wanted the right to appoint bishops, and moreover, he wanted to limit the infallibility or the powers of the Pope, so that all decisions of all the church, bishops, etc., in total amounted to the idea of infallibility. So we have wedded to this French conception is that locally, I control the benefices, I control the secular institutions, I control the appointment of bishops. So there is this nationalism into the French church, and to limit this idea of ultramonetism, the idea that the Pope, literally beyond the mountains, over the Alps in Italy, can just be, an arbitrary autocratic leader. And to complement this, therefore, it relies on this conception that we have to involve all of the prelates of Europe, all of the prelates of Catholicism, this idea of res publica Christiana, into essentially the framework of Christianity. And I think, again, that is quite an interesting sort of example to bring in.
Can I just say I completely support Louis XIV here. He's absolutely right to do so, and I endorse.
Just one point, but again, this relates. I'll refrain from using English exceptionalism if you don't find that term.
No. I mean, I'm happy to use it as long as it's not viewed in some sort of I don't know. As long as it's not to say that there's nothing. The people, because I mean, I don't want it to be this kind of chauvinism where all virtue lies within yourself and all vice lies within the other. That's not what I view it as. It's just a form of extreme particularism, I think.
That's interesting. I mean, I'm sure Panama and I would agree that we are all particularists. And in fact, linking this back, I mean, my points, which I was going to use for this as some form of framework, have long gone at this point.
Yeah, me too.
But one point that Panama sent over in preparation for this discussion, political power is least likely to be tyrannical when it is distributed in a cumbersome feudal model in which kings, lords, clergy, and smallholders balance each other. And of course, that's just relating to the relationships between the powers to one another. But I think, again, my conception is, I hate to say it, German, in the sense that I'm relaying this back to the Holy Roman Empire. And I've talked to Radical Liberation quite a lot about this idea of what it means to be a medieval anarchist, and this idea that within
monarchism.
Yes, within Germany, you have this loyalty not to the emperor, but you also have the loyalty to the city, the free and imperial city, to Bavaria, to Brunswick, to Saxony, to Hesse, to
Yeah.
Brandenburg, etc. And so I'm not just interested in this idea of the distribution of power among these various facets. And of course, this also builds into this idea of English liberty as well. The fact that each of these institutions holds on to this idea or conception of English liberty as pertaining to their own rights, but that this idea of a power distribution also needs to be distributed through regions, essentially, as well.
I think that, as you pointed out, England being the most centralized nation after the Norman conquest possibly made this an issue that came to the fore that didn't become necessary in other places.
Perhaps. I mean, that is interesting in the case that you bring up French absolutism. Why was French absolutism apparent, and why did such a system not happen in England? Well, England had already effectively united for 700 years, whereas the patrimony of the French king, even the geography of France, was constantly in flux for its entire history.
No, I think that's a very interesting angle. One thing when you were saying about power distribution, this I find interesting, because how to prevent the abuse of power. Now, I mean, I think that this is most exemplified in the sort of Brexit referendum, where whoever's making decisions has to be relatively close. But I also think
you can punch them, perhaps. Some say.
Yeah, well, hey, what Tyler would probably say yes. But the thing also is, and I can't stress this enough. I really think it's about goodwill. It's about an understanding of goodwill on the part of the people in charge, and it's very hard to see the goodwill that comes from the European Union. I'm sorry, I just don't see it. I see a bunch of bureaucrats who have an agenda that they're trying to enact for their own reasons, not for my good. And this again comes back to the sort of Robin Hood tales, where these people look like King John, and okay, they're lining their own pockets with my money, and I don't like that. And that's not what a legitimate ruler does. And so it's not even necessarily the distance that's the problem, but the distance is a guarantor of the goodwill of the people, because, as you say, Panama, we can walk over and punch them in the face.
Well, but just to add to what you were saying there, I mean, it's also this idea that, imagine if you're living in this English town where you've got your local lord or whatever, and you literally you see him every day. You see him, you speak to him, you know him and his acquaintances. Compare that to now, where the people who lord over us are these distant, even post the referendum, these distant
it's atrocious,
men
isn't it?
making deals for things that have absolutely no relation in any way to our lives or the lives of anybody outside themselves. It's just this kind of distant mafia working out its own things that we live in now. I mean, that is one of the most criminal things about the modern world is this utter lack of any kind of local power at all.
Absolutely. Yeah. Just think about it. I mean, one of the things I really push back on when it comes to absolute monarchy, and why I am not an absolute monarchist for very obvious reasons, is because part of the nature of absolute monarchy entails the isolation of the monarch, and this reliance is giving over into a form of managerialism. And what I find so attractive about earlier society, feudal society, etc., is I believe one of the most intrinsic things which connects the subject to the ruler is the right to petition, and not just the right to petition, the right to petition in person. So to my mind, a nation should be no larger than that of having the ability for everyone potentially to have access directly to the king's person.
I quite agree.
I mean, this idea of power being so distant from the population, ironically, it has been ushered in by modernism and democracy. Democracy has sort of confirmed that view. So, yes, just to advocate the idea, would you prefer to live in a system? I mean, it doesn't necessarily even have to be a king. You just have to find an advocate I mean, this could be a clergyman, it could be, a local lord, some form of uncorrupted legate, someone who is willing to bring, again, those grievances. And again, talking about this balance of power, this distribution of power. If you have an advocate in the form of some form of local authority who is genuinely actually invested in that region, and there is some, again, I don't want to at all. I don't want to give the impression, Sargon, that I'm rubbishing this idea of an essence which is intangible, because I think this is fundamental. This is the essence of what it means to enter into this mindset of being pre-political in the sense of the French Revolution. I mean, one of the things I really don't like doing. I mean, when I use the term ultra, I hate sort of defining myself in any way, because I really think there is just an organic order. And there is an order that is contrary to that. It almost doesn't need definition. When you're talking about political ideologies, it's just going into temporal specifics. But all of these ideas, even the idea of being a reactionary or being a liberal, as we've discussed, come out of this conception of the French Revolution. But linking this back to the idea of just proximity. How much better to have an advocate who is rooted in that territory. And one of the other points that Panama brought up to me before going on is this idea of the fundamental need for dynasty. And this is directly contrasted to this idea of the liberal conception of the nation state. Once you have defined something in the abstract, i.e. this is a nation, take France, for example, in the French Revolution. This is an example which now belongs to the people. It belongs to the nation. The people as an abstract don't exist, and they haven't existed at any point. Therefore, the nation becomes this nebulous, intangible concept, which is, again, almost a vehicle for the centralizing mechanisms of one source of power. In this case,
it becomes an excuse. It becomes an excuse to do things.
Whereas if you relay this back, the titular sort of notion of the monarchy changed during the French Revolution. Louis XVI, before he was beheaded, went from being king of France to king of the French. So therefore, you are not the possessor of a patrimony. You have moved to becoming the representative of a
king of an abstract.
To become an abstract. So linking this back to this idea of patrimony, patrimony again invests this idea of tradition baked into the political system, because what affects the monarch also affects his own domain. But if you localize this and you create again a local advocate and say a region, that's this, for example, say, I don't know, the Duke of Northumberland. You can go to the Duke of Northumberland. He has the ability to raise armies. He has his own lands and wealth. He's rooted into that region due to the family connections, the history of that region, and therefore it is in his interests. You can say this even with I'm not just talking abstract. This was a historical example with the Catholic populations in that area during the Northern Rising, during the reign of Elizabeth I. There is this connection which is dynastic, cultural, local, parochial to these various ideas, and harkening back to this idea of noblesse oblige. I'm not just talking about an abstract. This really did exist. Yes, it was corrupted, and what we know from our liberal historiography, this post hoc, post-Enlightenment version of history, which has been corrupted, is that we only remember the exception, and we don't remember what the system was meant to do.
I do agree completely with what you're saying here. The main problem I think that it has is it's slightly nostalgic. And I'm not saying nostalgia is a bad thing either, but the problem is we could never recreate it because it's something that wasn't created in the first place.
Oh yes, I agree, and this is the eternal sort of problem we're facing, is what we are doing. Yeah.
Sorry. If I can carry on just quickly. But also, there is actually quite a lot of this remaining in our representatives. The question is actually about the representative themselves. Are they someone who has this attitude and goodwill to their constituents, or are they ideologically possessed Rousseauians? Because what you're saying there is like the people, and I agree, the people being an abstract construct. And this is why I think Burke was such an effective counterpoint to what was being said, because the people doesn't really mean anything. It's very easy to suddenly find yourself not one of the people in this, and again, I'm going to call it the Rousseauian conception because I do think it is basically his. But the Burkean conception is totally three-dimensional. It runs from the very bottom of society to the very top of society, and does respect this idea of noblesse oblige. There's no question that the people at the top should be showing goodwill to those people at the bottom, because the patrimony of I'm going to focus on England for now, just because that's what I know. The patrimony of England is ours. It's not there's sort of Scruton's first person plural there. It's not mine or yours. It's ours, and it's something we all have, and we all have a responsibility for. And so there are politicians, and I hate to say it, who are surprisingly responsive if you email them. Some of them, of course, many of them probably, are terrible. And most of those, I would guess, are the Labour politicians. But there are some Conservative politicians who are surprisingly amenable to just receiving an email from you. As I learned with Philip Davies, when I was, I'm sure he'd appreciate a thank you email for standing up to the feminist harpies in Parliament. And he basically messaged me saying, please don't do that again. I respond to all my emails in my inbox, and I didn't even think about it, because I had assumed that he had this haughty view of, I'm the politician, I'm not responding to the plebs. And it turns out that there are some that do still continue this tradition. And so it's not that this has gone away, it's that the form of it has changed. And it changed, of course, because no one was in control of the way these things were evolving.
I must wonder, is this not just an example, like the monarchy, of just a dead form wearing the skin of an old one, basically?
I think that's a bit cynical. I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm saying I think I would approach it with a little more love and charity and say that this is just the new phase of the continuum that is our civilization, and in the future it'll doubtless be different. But I think the thing that does unite it is the idea that there is, and again, I keep using the phrase goodwill, but I haven't got anything better to describe it, because I do think it is about the intent, the morale that underlies this thing. Are we in it together, or are we out for ourselves? And it seems that it's very easy to fall into I'm out for myself because the social contract permits X, Y, and Z, and you have no recourse, to instead a more sort of sentimental way of, I don't actually want to hurt these people around me. And maybe I actually would gain a lot of personal good feeling and sentiment from the people around me if I were to be good. And, I think there is something to this.
I just want to confirm your point. I mean, you mentioned the fact nostalgia isn't playing into my conception. I mean, this is me sort of looking back to historical examples and finding some form of example which can form basically like a working prototype for something that we would want. However, you're completely right in the sense that history cannot be recreated, in the way that we're sort of constructing some sort of Disneyland of historical restoration. I'm sadly of the view that most history is cyclical, and if not cyclical, it's is a long sort of stage of decline. So in this instance, I mean, when I'm talking about this,
sorry to interrupt, but is this not just the most English perspective on things ever? It's like in the long ago, things were just much better,
No, well, I mean, yes, I mean,
and then the Vikings got here, and then the Normans got here, and then the Dutch got here. And
I would call it a long stretch of marsh on which there are a few peaks. Basically, that's how I would describe history.
I wasn't trying to be flippant. I do agree with you as well. I do genuinely agree with you.
No, it's fine. I think this, but again, this fundamental notion of recreation. I mean, I'm talking about hundreds of years. I mean, this whole idea of us contriving the scenario of bringing this back. I mean, it sort of horrifies me. It also horrifies me because it would be completely postmodern. All of this would be us adopting us deciding to consciously adopt a system and deciding it was true, and therefore imposing all of the, again, this organic sort of conception of order onto something which is entirely artificial. So when I'm looking at it,
wouldn't it?
Yes. So when I'm looking at this again in terms of defeating this idea of the simulacra or postmodernism, I'm looking at this as a development that'll take hundreds of years. So I'm looking at this in the very long term. But I want to make this conversation a little spicier and bring up another of Panama Hat's points, which is following on from your relationship with the representative.
Before we do, could I put a quick cap on this? Because I very much understand, and I didn't mean to use nostalgia in a derogatory way either. I have got a very similar reading of history to both of you on this, where there's a coziness about things, right? That I wish to see a return to.
Like finding a rich heirloom in the attic, isn't it?
Yes, yeah, and one day, the proper king will return and he'll put the world in the right frame of mind. It's not he's going to fix the problems, but it's the fact that at the moment it feels like there's an illegitimate method of thought that occupies our highest positions, and it's cruel and it's cold and it's foreign and it's weird and it's wrong, and I don't like it. And I want to definitely have a return to politicians who are like, well, actually, I actually know Bob on the corner shop, and I actually would like to help him. I would like a reciprocal sort of civilization rather than this abstract categorical civilization of hate crime laws and races. And it's like, oh God, what is happening to them?
It's essentially you've stripped away all of the kind of sorry to go off on a tangent. I know this is meant to be a cap, but one of the principles of authentic reaction, as I'm trying to form it, is this idea that humans have all these problems which you can't solve, but you can alleviate, or you can kind of ennoble, if you like. So, for example, humans have to be ruled; they have to be governed in some way. And the system that we were talking about, where this kind of personalism and this localism, where you know the person that is meant to speak for your locality and that is represents you to the powers that be in the land. What you've done is you've basically taken this problem of how do you have this political system that isn't so tyrannical, and you've personalized it. You've brought it to a personal level in a way that seems to work. And what you've done is you've taken all that away until all you have is the rulers and the ruled. That's all there is now. I know that we still live in relatively peaceful times, but to me, all we have now is the swing of a stick, basically.
Inertia, isn't it? That's keeping the system going. But no, the problem is essentially the career politician. And this is, I think, one of the things I really liked about Donald Trump, because, you can say whatever you like about the man, but you can't say that he didn't love America. He 100% loved his country. And so this shone through. This was his prime virtue. And this is why half the country absolutely adored him. There's just no getting around it. Compared to every other politician has got a commitment to something else. Joe Biden has a commitment against climate change or whatever it is, but Donald Trump didn't have any of that. And he clearly loved hanging out with the people, the mob, the regular folk. He clearly likes these people.
Do you remember that tweet I made some weeks ago about, I think it was only about last week, where I pointed out that in medieval courts, taking up a political office was one, you wouldn't be paid for it. There was no such thing as a paid politician, and two, it was something that you did reluctantly. It was and you read in the medieval accounts and the legends and things. There's this recurring theme that somebody who covets an office in a state is not to be trusted. They're a bad person because they're coveting something that most men know will probably end up being a stain on their honor, because that's what politics is, basically.
It's what power is.
Dirty art, yeah. And I mean, this. Yeah, I completely agree. Essentially, the whole idea of career politicians who are just paid to sit on their asses in Parliament and do that for a living and end up with kickbacks is despicable.
The judgment of Trump being unprofessional is actually the key endorsement of him, because if you think, okay, well, who is a politically correct politician endorsing? Well, who does he represent? then it's very obvious he represents a corporate interest, something that's disembodied, that's not really a person, that doesn't have quirks and foibles and flaws in that typically human way. Whereas Trump obviously is a person. He's obviously a regular person trapped in the body of a billionaire, and so there's a genuine authenticity about that kind of politics that I would love to see a return to. And anyone who speaks like Justin Trudeau compared to speaking like Donald Trump, that in and of itself should be a stigma. That should be a mark of alienation and despicable, just grossness. You speak to me like that, and I loathe you.
Just a couple of things before I bring into this, but again, it's more of a cap off to all of the things we've already addressed. But one example, I mean, looking back to this, I wondered, because I will admit, I was quite dumbstruck and horrified when Donald Trump won. And again, I tried to sort of rationalize why was I so horrified? And I think America is essentially a monarchy. And that this is because I adopt a view of monarchy which isn't blinkered by this conception of the hereditary nature of it. Most monarchies throughout history weren't hereditary. They were hereditary after they stabilized. But America is essentially a elected monarchy with term limits. And what the American presidency is I mean, even looking back to the inauguration of George Washington, what did they play? What was the anthem played? It was "God Save the King." They had no other. They had no other alternative to it. So
the Americans were quite keen to get a throne, weren't they, at the beginning? Yeah.
This is David Starkey's point that essentially they didn't really know what to do, and so they just set up an elected monarchy in the style of the British monarchy.
Yes, they set up an elected monarchy. They set up an indirectly elected House of Lords and a directly elected House of Commons. But yes,
bring back God Save the King.
but of course, the interesting notion of this is that it is truly monarchical in that sense, because the president is head of both the government and he is head of the state. And of course, what happened in this country is that those positions became diffused, and of course, the head of state is almost completely irrelevant. But because the president still occupies the position of head of state in addition to head of government, again, he is supposed to imbue this continuation of monarchy. He is the representative of the entire nation in the same way that we talk about the monarch and his patrimony. But again, linking this back to this idea of absolutism, absolutism was based on this conception of the king as sacred. The king is something you can't, again, quite approach, or there have to be intermediaries in the way. And the king is supposed to embody the state, and he's supposed to embody a form of perfection. Obviously, with what distinguishes the American monarchy from Christian European monarchy is this idea of divine right. That wasn't the basis of the American monarchy, but nevertheless there was this form of civic perfection which the American monarch was supposed to represent. So what we found in Donald Trump was an advocate for the nation who was in complete, contrast with this idea of civic perfection, which is again this continual sort of a holdover from this idea of monarchy, from which the concept of the American presidency arrives. But I tried to find like an actual example of a monarch, a real tangible monarch in the way that we conceive it doing this. And I'd actually point to the example of Wilhelm II of Germany, someone who was very erratic, someone who hated the media, someone who had an interesting relationship to let's say with the institutions, with the chancellery, with the Reichstag, and was an unapologetic defender of Germany. No one will sort of dispute the fact that Wilhelm II loved Germany, and he adopted something which was a position which was seen as less than that expected of a sacred monarch. I mean, even if you look at the actual sort of German transcripts of his writings, there is a fascinating aspect of Wilhelm II in that he's speaking almost in the manner of a demagogue, like a Trump figure, as opposed to the more formal, restrained, and serene status of a king. So that's just an interesting way of bringing this up. But the real point I wanted to come back to after that tangent, based on your conversation, was another point which Panama Hat brought up before, which is democracy is a heretical theology that asserts the supremacy of man over God. Discuss.
Yes.
Oh wow!
I will totally co-sign that statement. That's absolutely right.
I wasn't expecting
I didn't expect that. No.
Yes, but the main contention, I think, is the assumption that kings are put in their place by God.
Well, again,
I
sorry,
would
Plan,
dispute
I'll
that.
let you go. Yeah.
Well, I would dispute that kings are put in their place by God, but I think that basically when one assumes the mantle of king, you rule by the law of God and as an absolute, basically, or you doom yourself.
Yes, I mean, looking back to Bossuet, I mean, it is clear, it is crystal clear in the idea of absolutism that the king is bound to the law. And again, the fact that the king is actually bound to this law means, again, my point about French absolutism is the fragility is the fact that the king can't break the constitution. He can't adopt a purely despotic form of rule. Instead, he has to compromise and purposely ignore aspects of the constitution, but he cannot be seen to completely override them. This idea that the king is, again, the vice regent of God on earth has to be inculcated, and once the king has spurned that, for example, if he were to err into heresy or adopt a different religion, or to be seen as despotic, I mean, you have to remember the influence that Aristotle and his political conceptions had on medieval Europe. Of course, Aristotle's conceptions were the basis of scholasticism, Plato and Aristotle, but also Thomism, as we understand it, which is a crucial understanding of how the Catholics essentially see the world, which is again part of this inheritance from Aristotle, interwoven with Catholic theology through to St. Thomas Aquinas. But looking at this in particular, sorry, I've completely forgotten what I was going to say now.
Well, can I jump in here, because I think the model of maybe it's because I'm English, but I'm hearing the word absolutism and God and all of this, and just thinking, oh, good, I get to hear about some foreign nonsense now.
Yes,
right?
yes, but
Well,
the crucial distinction,
think...
the crucial distinction, though, is that one is founded on something which the king cannot change. The king cannot change Christianity. He cannot, overtly change dogma.
It's a power beyond the throne.
It's a power beyond him. It's a form of, again, looking back at Catholic integralism. The idea is that the king is bound by a moral foundation. Again, this is wedded explicitly in the idea of the coronation oath. The king makes an oath before God to uphold certain principles, is explicit as a condition of him occupying this position, receiving the anointment, which again is essentially the eighth sacrament. It transfigures the king into something which isn't quite human, but isn't quite God, some form of intermediary position. And the expectations therefore placed upon the king are extreme. And once the king breaks that and he is seen as a tyrant, invariably it was far easier, I would think, to depose a king than it is to depose our current band of oligarchs. Whereas democracy, as contrast to this, it completely does away with this idea. I mean, when Panama sent me the idea of its heretical theology, I mean, heresy and idolatry are different. Heresy means you have adopted a position which is at odds with the Orthodox Church position. Heterodox change. And I was just thinking, how could democracy be incorporated into Catholic thought? And well, there you can sort of make the argument, albeit you'll find it ridiculous, that democracy, this idea of popular acclamation, is some form of genuine representation of the will of the Holy Spirit. So there is some sort of Christian
very Rousseauian again.
One can bring into democracy, but that's my point. The idea is rooted in Christianity, and then it becomes idolatrous. It has Christian roots, and then it evolves into something which is God can be dispensed with. It is no longer the popular acclamation through the guise of the Holy Spirit. It is the popular will has assumed a sacredness in and of itself, and therefore any system can be trumped. Any law, any norm can be overridden. And of course, I mean, the fascinating thing about Rousseau is that there is an aspect of, again, this idea of restorationism, as bizarre as this sounds, of remembrance, of sympathy with the past, because it is this fundamental idea that man is born free, but everywhere he finds himself in chains. So if anything, he is far more nostalgic and idealistic about the past than we all are. But again, it's based on this fundamentally false conception, because the chains, we talked about a chain of continuity. Well, what Rousseau is talking about is a chain which constricts. There is no tradition. Instead, there is this hallowed place that we need to return to, and everything, therefore, needs to be dispensed with. And the vehicle for this is the popular will, is democracy. So it comes out of this thinking, but as a result of it, democracy becomes idolatrous. It acts itself as supreme over God. And the best example of that, you can probably argue, is Robespierre's terror and virtue. The popular will, it will compel people through terror, through mass executions, to adopt a position of, sublime virtue. And of course, aspects of deism can be associated with this, and of course this formed part of Rousseau's conception, but it's fundamentally post-Christian.
Okay, I mean, I agree with your characterization of everything there, and I don't think that you're wrong. And I think this is a part of the full spectrum dominance of Rousseauian French Enlightenment thought. The problem, and I think Edmund Burke had this bang to rights when he said, well, democracy is useful sometimes, but you don't want to set up a democracy in a military because you'll end up with a military dictatorship. And he predicts Napoleon very accurately. And it's one of those things where it's like, okay, well, in its time and place, a democratic system is a good idea. It's a good idea if you've got to elect someone who's going to go and represent you in Parliament, to be able to choose who you're going to elect, and the local area should get together, have a vote. Okay, well then, this person won the most votes, that person is then the decided. But if he does a bad job, then we can just choose someone else in 5 years' time. That's a good idea. That's not to say that the classroom should be democratic. That's not to say that your bedroom should be democratic. It probably is actually now. So I shouldn't say the bedroom. Maybe the family should be democratic. That's not to say that it's useful or good or desirable in every aspect of life, but in its proper place and its proper context, it is a useful thing to have.
I must reject this completely. I have to. This is
but hang on. Let me carry on, because in fact that this gets me to the Catholic aspect of this. So the reason that I think that the English approve of democracy in the way that they do, and I think it is this kind of limited scope democracy that they approve of. I don't see anyone hankering for democracy in the workplace apart from communists, for example. Again, another place where it's just not a necessary or useful feature, and it's obviously for a different agenda than the success of the business. I think that the English conception of kingship goes before Christianity. It goes back long before Christianity. And I think that the Christian veneer that is put across the English, and I think AA is right on this, that there are pagan traditions, and we call them pagan, but I don't think they're necessarily religious.
Well, this is I think just importantly, something to remember about early Christianity and Catholicism as it existed for a very long time is that it wasn't really as orthodox as one might think, because in a sense it didn't abolish a lot of what you might call pagan traditions. It absorbed them, and it became part of the local worship, basically. Yeah, and that still exists today.
I totally agree with that characterization as well. But the idea of kingship wasn't something that came from Catholicism to the English. No. They already had it, and it was, and it's not just kingship. So if anyone hasn't seen my the Thesis of Conservatism video, that's honestly, I think a lot of what I'm basing on there is what I'm going to just call the relational view of the world. There are certain stations in life that have relationships that have moral connections between one another. You're talking the king and the peasants, you're talking husbands and wives, mothers and daughters, fathers and sons. These are stations in life that have a relation connected to them conceptually. You can't separate the idea of the relationship of a father to son from the concept of father and son. And the concept of being a son, you necessitates having a father, even if you don't know him, And this is where the moral fault comes from being an absentee father, because there's an expectation in that of the adherence to a certain kind of relationship that is a moral necessity. And this, I think, relational view of the world goes right the way back into the sort of pagan traditions. And this is where the Anglo-Saxon view of the Burkean sort of three-dimensional, hang on, we're all in this together, we're all somehow connected to one another, and so we all have to show some goodwill to one another for all of this to work. This is very pre-theoretical and very instinctual and intuitive, and it's all felt. It's all felt. And so when we get to this kind of theoretical abstraction of the Catholic monarch, who's the absolute, he's placed there by God. I mean, all I'm hearing as an Englishman is foreign French nonsense, right? And
yes,
I'm just
but
thinking,
who is this brought in by? I'm sorry, but James the First and
I'm
Sixth
not
was
saying
far more explicitly absolutist than Henry the Fourth of France was at the same
Yeah.
time,
Yeah.
and he
I'm
was
saying-
born as a began as a Calvinist, raised as a Calvinist, and he became a strict Episcopalian, a strict defender of Anglicanism. So there is.
I'm not saying that no Englishman has done nothing wrong, or has had a bad idea or anything like that. What I mean is, in the broad scope of what it is, English tradition here, I think this is something wrong. This is something out of the ordinary and something that doesn't fit with what had come before. And so, I'm not, like I said, I'm not trying to absolve the English of any wrongdoing or anything like this or bad ideas, but it just seems like it's really taken hold on the continent, whereas I'm pretty sure we killed a monarch or two over it.
Well, the fascinating thing is, I would argue, again, I will argue, that absolutism wasn't an improvement on feudalism. Essentially, feudalism broke down because there was a fundamental conflict between the nobility and the monarch. And rather than resolve that conflict, the monarch bypassed the nobility or richly humiliated the nobility in the form of absolutism. That's why absolutism, say, for example, in France or in Austria or Spain, became a political necessity because of the breakdown of the relationship between the monarch and the estates, in this particular instance, the second estate. In England, the same thing happened. There was just a breakdown in relationship between the papacy, the church, and the king. So we had a form of absolutism. It's Anglicanism, the idea that the king is, head of the church, and there are no restraints and appeals there is a restraint of appeals back to Rome. But this idea of, Catholic monarchy, feudal monarchy, I mean, I would look at Edward III, for example. Edward III and Richard the Lionheart. These kings were not only great sort of Catholic monarchs, crusading monarchs in the vein of a medieval monarch, if not that, they're exemplars. Both of them were not only great kings; they were some of the most powerful, influential kings. But they set a standard from which other kings in Europe wished to imitate. And even looking at someone like Charles II, all the kings essentially in the 17th century, James I, Charles I, Charles II, James II, all of them looked to France for inspiration.
Yes.
So again, this continental interweaving the monarchy, it was, from my point of view, consistent. I mean, in terms of your argument about the pagan roots of the monarchy, I mean, yes, I will completely argue with that, with the idea of the Anglo-Saxon statelets coming over here, Hengist and Horsa, were pagan, and they were later subsequently re-Christianized. But there has never been a king of England who was pagan. The first king of England was Athelstan. I think I understand your point, but just to finish my point, relaying this back to 1688, I mean, you can say that the form of English monarchy that we adopted, again, it wasn't a form of English monarchy at all that was adopted in 1688. You could argue that it was a form of Dutch stadtholdership, the idea of the monarch as steward, the monarch as not, again, acting through this idea of divine right, or the monarch as integral to this idea of executive rule, but that the head of state is a steward in a post-monarchical society. That was a system which was conceived of when the Dutch got rid of their king in the late 16th century, and it was essentially imported to England and given the trappings of a continuity of English constitutionalism. But in essence, that is essentially what happened.
I'm not saying that these things didn't exist. What I'm saying is that there was an inherent contradiction that eventually was resolved, and it obviously took many hundreds of years to resolve. But I think that the monarch as steward, that's not quite the right frame. I think maybe the right frame might actually be as father. I think Robert Filmer's called it patriarcha for a reason, right? Like the idea is that there's a kind of fatherly nature. It's not just that you have taken on the job of a custodian of a building or something. That there is a paternal aspect, and this is one of the emotional relationships that connects the monarch to the people at large, the population, and that's where I think they draw a lot of their expectations from. And it's not a kind of infantilizing relationship either that I think was envisaged. It's just one of those, if I were to call my own father up now and say I need some advice, he would give me well-intentioned advice for my best interests. And this is the moral texture of the relationship. It's to take the best interest at heart. And I agree with you that England has never had a non-Christian king, of course, but the English have had non-Christian kings. And I think that was what underpinned the nature of the relationship, because you don't really want your father to be a domineering tyrant, and no father wants to be a domineering tyrant. And so there's no need for the English to...
Just to clear this up, so sorry, Panama,
Sorry.
I'll let you speak in a moment, but what I'm emphasizing here, I have no, as you can probably emphasize and you can relate, I don't think either of us want tyranny. I mean, monarchy degenerates into tyranny, but monarchy itself is not tyranny. When we're talking about this idea of patriarchate, and again, the example that Filmer brings in, and this is prevalent through a lot of absolutist thinking, which is rooted in scripture, is this harkening back to an even older precedent than just even the existence of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. But it goes back to King Solomon and goes back to King David. It goes back to the ancient kingdom of Israel. But relaying this back to a conception of monarchy, which I'm trying to get at post 1688, after the importation of the electors of Hanover, in 1714, after Queen Anne died, a remarkable situation essentially happened in that the king performed a constitutional function, but he essentially left the responsibility for day-to-day government in the hands of other officials. I'm not saying this of course happened throughout history, in minority reigns, even in France. One of the fundamental aspects which underpins the beginning of absolutism is the complete isolation of the political interest of the monarch, in this case Louis XIII. But the fundamental difference here is that there was never any dispute in the case of France that the king ultimately had sole authority. The king was the source of legitimacy. The king was therefore ultimately responsible. What I'm arguing happened in the English case is that the monarchs ceased to have this aspect of political responsibility. Yes, the father, can give advice, but the father is meant to be there to ultimately hold this idea of responsibility. He is not there to give counsel to his children and let children deal with the affairs of the government. What we have now, essentially, with the Queen is the children making all the decisions, the Queen whispering and no one taking any notice. I will even argue that the Queen is not necessarily whispering in the opposite direction either. So what I'm fundamentally
live in a monarchy,
so what I'm fundamentally trying to get through here is that without responsibility, without the source of power and legitimacy emanating from the monarch, but emanating from something else, this isn't just a legalistic conception. This obviously permeates through our understanding of our own constitution in the modern day. Monarchy simply fulfills a strictly constitutional function. In that sense, the monarch becomes steward. And this wasn't just something that happened immediately with 1688. With 1688, it should be known that William of Orange was an active monarch in foreign affairs. Like I said, he effected a diplomatic revolution. In a sense, he brought England away from France and in opposition to it for the next 100 years. Nevertheless, when we have the importation of the kings of Hanover, there is essentially a form of early absentee government, and this is why we have the evolving office of the First Lord of the Treasury becoming the Prime Minister. It happens during the reign of the first Hanoverian king, and the Prime Minister is Robert Walpole. So what we see is that Parliament becomes the obvious counterweight to this, responsible body for this lack of responsibility from the monarch himself. Parliament begins to give responsible governments, and then after a while it moves beyond this idea of aristocracy, oligarchy, to becoming a form of democratic rule. And ironically, I've always contended that democracy in this country, the nucleus of democracy, which was really brought in with 1867, was ushered in by Disraeli, who had a fundamentally reactionary mindset. He was bringing in the lower orders to rebel against the aristocracy in the hope that they would ally with the palace. Well, of course, ultimately, this just opened the floodgates for the complete expansion of the state and the dependence, people's dependence on the state, albeit this, again, isn't a process that was ushered in overnight. It took another 100 years for that to be the case.
Well, I just want to. This feels like a bit of a trace back now, but I want to make the point about absolutism that it basically, once you have created an absolutist monarchy, it puts you on a timer. Your days are now numbered essentially, because when you have the kind of you might say the Catholic, though of course it's not exclusive to that. Pretty much all monarchical cultures have this. Is this kind of monarch where the monarchy does not always need to be this kind of powerhouse of politics. There can be times when it can be quiet, and there can be times when it can kind of simply, it just ensure that there is peace in the kingdom and continue to move forward. What you have when you have an absolutist state is that eventually, you can have a kind of Tudor, you might say, correct me if this is wrong, Ian, but a kind of Tudor absolutism under Henry and those that followed, and you can go all the way up to Charles I, when all of a sudden you're basically doomed, because now the pressure is simply too great on the monarchy as an institution. It is, but I think by becoming absolutist, you shackle yourself, and then eventually you won't be able to bear it. I think
just to buttress that, I mean, absolutism requires one of two things. It requires a exceptional monarch, and we had this in the form of Elizabeth I. And the system that she engendered, I mean, she wasn't always on side with Parliament. In fact, her last days in office were often in conflict with Parliament. However, she was able to cultivate a cult of personality. The Queen as Gloriana, the Queen as the Virgin Queen. Again, this idea of English absolutism can really be summarized with Elizabeth I. Also, Elizabeth as the Supreme Governor of the Church of England, and Elizabeth as maintaining absolute English sovereignty in opposition to Catholic Spain. So yes, all of these ideas of English absolutism, you can say, were albeit without French aspects such as the large standing army or the vast state apparatus. Elements of it were apparent with Elizabeth. What James I and Charles I then did was fail to successfully imitate that system. And with James II, what I find remarkable about James II is that he wasn't deposed because of he was an absolutist. He was deposed because he tried to unravel one of the absolutist underpinnings of the Elizabethan monarchy, which is the Church of England, which turned the High Tories against him. So ironically, when we look at the Glorious Revolution, it was a cabal of Whigs and High Tories who believed they were defending one of the crucial aspects of English monarchy, which was adherence to the Church of England. And of course, if you want to look into this, look into the Declaration of Indulgence. But to refer this back to France, I mean, France is probably the much better example in the sense that absolutism creates this form of managerialism, and we see it through the monarchies of the 19th century that didn't just become dependent on Parliament like eventually Spain did or Britain did. With the system in Germany or with the system in Austria, the monarch becomes, even though power derives from the monarch becomes far and more dependent on a vast state apparatus, various departments, a foreign ministry, tax collecting revenues, but also to talk about Prussian socialism. Bismarck in Germany ushered in a massive system of Prussian socialism, state management of the economy. And again, this is a fundamental aspect of absolutism, which is mercantilism. This idea that the state becomes almost state capitalist and begins directly interfering in the economy. But all of this, again, it promotes this managerial system. So by the time you get to the end of the First World War, Wilhelm II is basically irrelevant in terms of the great scheme of power. He's not even held up as the representative institution of the state that has been taken over by a general. The entire state is run by a system of professional managers and military men, and Bismarck was the first of these. So yes, I do believe that absolutism creates the conditions of a centralized, bureaucratic, all-encompassing state that ultimately makes the monarch irrelevant, unless it's part of the system of legitimacy.
Could I jump in here? Right. So the way I'm conceiving of this, and what I'm hearing from your explanations of your positions, or your explanations of absolutism in particular, is again like, and the fact that and I agree with you. And this honestly, I I do view this as I was thinking of your explanation of the Catholic underpinnings and justification of the monarch that you gave earlier. And I find this very interesting because, once again, it comes down to a system of rules, right? It's a system. It's a very intellectualized construction that you have a series of interlocking ideas, and once this foundation is complete, then you have created a sort of metaphysic that is in some way perfect, and it generates certainty. And this, in my view, is not what the traditional and I'll use the term pagan for the sake of argument, nature of Anglo-Saxon society as we have inherited it is. And I'm not saying it's never had any interplay or interweaving of this intellectualized view of the system and civilization and society. But I think that when that has come in, the contradiction there that has been, the below the surface level intuitive North FC view of these things compared to the intellectual, how are we justifying having a king from a Christian perspective? When these things come into contradiction, it seems that the North FC view wins. And this means that I think that the foundation of what English society is, and in some aspect has always been, is a series of good faith cooperations and negotiations between people in different stations of
life. But I think that's quite literally what AM and I are arguing for.
No. I don't think you are. I don't know what you're arguing for, because you seem very skeptical of absolutism, right? So I'm not saying you're in favor of absolutism, but I think that it's from this absolutist position that you arrive at the need for a state bureaucracy that micromanages every aspect of someone's life, because you're not allowing uncertainty to be a core part of the system. What you're trying to do is eliminate uncertainty with a very complex and rigid series of rules that require a bureaucrat for more certainty, more power, more cooperation. And what this does is it gets away from the sort of I think it was Tacitus, who I can't remember who it was. It was some Roman author who was saying that the Germans, they get together, they drink, they argue out the issues, and then the next day they make a political decision. And what that means is what underpins this is good faith. The idea that this is trustworthy people around you that will also have your interests at heart when expressing their own.
I think just to emphasize, when I'm explaining absolutism, I'm explaining why the system fails and why we can't be in favor of it. I have no interest. I have no interest in micromanaging people, creating all of these institutions to compensate for a fundamental lack, which absolutism is there to try and compensate for. I think this is fundamentally we're arriving at the same points, where there's a little bit of differentiation in terms of our conception. Obviously, Catholicism being a big one, but I don't in terms of this organicness of the system. I mean, this is why I'm so pessimistic about any sort of.
Can I just insist a second? Because the reason I'm hammering this point is to definitively articulate that I think the goal should be heading towards more faith in the people around us and ourselves, and this sort of more homely, naturalistic form of society. And this is, I'm not saying you're for any of the excesses of absolutism or anything like that. I'm not trying to imply any of that. So if that came across, I am sorry. I apologize. But I think that's the reason that it heads in that direction. And without identifying that reason, we can't get anything to head in a different direction. And this is exactly the problem with the Enlightenment, is it just abolishes this idea that we should have faith in one another. In fact, especially Rousseau's view of it, which is why it's so different to the English view, I think, is that, Rousseau's express intention in the social contract is that no man is dependent on another man. they're completely dependent on the state, and that's a direct quote. And so the idea that is the total opposite of pretty much all of English history, in my opinion, and the total opposite of what we should be aiming for. And in fact, it seems like a moral abomination. The idea that we're not dependent on one another for something, even if it's just moral support, even if it's just friendship. Like the very idea seems to undermine the concept of what it is to have a civilization. And so this and that seems to be like the highest form of absolutism in a way, like the most certainty.
Yes, but I think that just to very quickly summarize your points, what I'm arguing for in 1688, I'm not saying that one path was lost to us, which is that path, and we gained another path. What I'm saying is that both paths would have probably left us in the same direction, which is more statism, more managerialism, and ultimately some form of socialism, democracy, what have you, albeit through different historical tangents. And that again is like almost the pessimism which is inherent in my position. What I'm saying is that elements of English absolutism never worked. There was one instance with Elizabeth I, and that isn't really even an instance of English absolutism. And this system doesn't continue. So when you're talking about this harkening back to this conception of English liberalism, again, it's this whole idea of remembrance or an organic order. And this is where I want to bring in to finish my point, my conception of liberty. My conception of liberty is entirely dependent on, in this case, I'm going to bring in personal faith. I believe liberty is the fact that you are afforded free will, you're afforded conscience, you're afforded a basic level of autonomy, and you can choose, you have the power to either act in the instance of following in God's order or contravening that order and trying to fashion something of your own creation. To me, that is the fundamental basis of liberty. It is that fundamental choice between those two options, of obviously varying degrees between them. But what the state does, the state cannot legislate freedom. The state cannot legislate liberty. Liberty is already there before the state comes into it. The state can offer license. The state can determine certain things. But what I'm trying to get at is that I have a conception of politics which is not dependent on any sort of construction of the state. When I refer to monarchy, why I'm interested in the idea of monarchy and non-democratic forms of government is because they are ultimately dependent on this idea of the king as a vicar, the king as a vice-regent, the representative as a vice-regent, the republic as embodying, you don't have to just bring in monarchy, but you can bring in some form of aristocratic institutions in the same case, that they are all advocating for a form of authority which is beyond them, and they can either follow or they can be in contravention of. What I'm saying with democracy, statism, managerialism, is that system ultimately bypasses this. So what I'm actually trying to get at is that there is much more in common in terms of our basic conceptions than it would appear if you take this view. And you have to take the fundamental position of liberty, which liberty is founded on personal autonomy to either do good or to do harm. And the state has no relation to that whatsoever. The state is purely concerned with the temporal functioning of, beyond the family, which is the first incarnation of the state, the first interaction of political association with others. The state is there supposedly, again, to protect some form of unit, whether it be the family, whether it be the tribe, whether it be the polis, whether it be the city. Everything beyond that, all the complications that are associated with that, is almost an irrelevance to me, because it doesn't in any way pertain to this core conception of liberty.
So I suppose I would take issue with the core conception of liberty. I'm not sure that absolute personal autonomy is what I would consider liberty to really be.
Oh no, it's not absolute. I think that's the thing. It's not absolute. It's freedom. It's freedom to do the wrong thing. It's freedom of conscience. Right. Again, the idea of absolute autonomy from God. Again, that is literally Satanism. So I can't be in favour of absolute.
It's literally ostracism. I mean,
before you respond to it, Carl, could I add on the sort of in the kind of political sense? I'd say liberty is also the ability to. For a man, especially, to be master of his own affairs and his own livelihood and his own children and his own kind of small polity in of itself, if you see what I mean. Yes. I think in the conception I have of what a society is, there aren't really individuals. There are families and communities more so than individuals, and that to me is a big part of what political liberty is. It's this concept that. You might just be some carpenter, say, but that means that you basically are a master of your own finances, and you provide for a family, and you're master of you have your own property and your own house and your own trade and your own mind, if you will, which is something that obviously now is becoming quite a distant past, that the whole idea of that. But yes, I would just add that on to the whole definition of liberty.
No, I definitely agree with who owns your children. You do, without with an iron fist if you're sensible.
I don't think we would ever dispute that.
No, exactly. But yeah, I do understand what your position is, and I honestly, I agree with the outcome of what you're aiming for. Like, I agree. I don't want the state interfering unduly with anything that I want either. But again, there's something about the conception that feels, and I'm going to use very fluffy language with this, cold and calculated.
Really?
Do you not agree?
What you mean? The things that we're using in the definition?
Well, no. The way you lay it out, like you have a series of hard a priori rules that have been formulated in advance of coming in. Yeah, the or desires, or like ideal laws that you'd have. The way that the world would be governed, and it strikes me that again this is almost falling into the same problem of searching for certainty where it can't really be found. And I'm not trying to be critical. I know it sounds harsh and critical, but I'm not trying to be. I'm trying to put across what I mean in the most charitable and good faith way I can put it. But I think there's something about this conception that has almost a beguiling effect, where you have theorized a great deal, but not much has come of it. And were it to be something you were to be bringing about, it would be a much more radical change than would be organic, right?
But you're missing my fundamental point. I am not interested in the least in being a political activist. I have no conception of any sort of ideal political order. In fact, I believe that any conception of ideal political order, by the face of it, is nonsense, because I believe in a tragic conception of humanity, which is going to constantly fail and is constantly in the need of reform. I don't.
They're both very anti-humanist, I think.
I don't believe in any of this conception.
Defend the human cause.
The only sort of difficulty, again, bringing faith into this, is that I strive, and again, just look at G.K. Chesterton as an example. I strive to be as orthodox in my understanding of my own conception of Christianity, and in terms of my own sort of formulation of principles a priori. I simply want to live in a system, therefore, which doesn't continually demand of me that I have to abandon all of these principles. That's it. It's not an ideal political order. And because I think we've gone so far, and the system has become so corrupted, I'm almost entirely pessimistic. And because of it, there's nothing I can do. I'm not going to contrive a situation where something resembling the past is going to come out of this. What has to come out of this is something new and something I cannot possibly predict.
I'm not saying that the intent is that you wish to, turn yourself into Marx and craft a perfect world and then try and impose that on the universe. But I do think there is an idealism that underpins that. It's not that you have to throw away your principles, but I think we have to concede that there are going to be times where you have to compromise on them in some ways.
This is the whole arc of temporal governance. Every form of temporal governance is a compromise. This is why I'm not an idealist. I look at every system and realize there is no idealized system. There is no perfect form of world government. Every system that exists, every form, every nation, every tribe, every family, everything is formulated on compromise. My own personal instincts, I would argue, sans Christianity, are thoroughly libertarian. I just fundamentally want to be left alone. The reason why I'm forcing this essentially into my understanding, which you may think of as contriving some sort of situation, albeit I'll forget that you try to imply some sort of connection with Marx. I know what you mean. I know what you mean. I'm just being rebellious. It is simply I'm simply in the position where it is no longer tangible, it is no longer convenient, where I can possibly hold a purely libertarian conception. I have to hold true to these principles if I'm going to produce a family, and that family is going to produce anything of value, or contribute something, not just to the human race, but in the image of God. All of these things concern me, and I'm talking mainly now about survival. I have no idea when we're going to see the breakdown of the system that we're currently living in, and what will come of it. And I'm actually fascinated to see what will eventually happen. And this is why I refute the idea that I'm an idealist or I'm contriving, because there is absolutely nothing I can conceive of here. I can point to history, and I can try and give you the best sort of conception of history in terms of my own understanding of it.
There we go.
And that's all I'm doing. I'm using my historical conception. Again, I'm not a political philosopher.
Well,
I'm using history to inform my view, and it could be misconstrued as nostalgia or some form of Disneyland form of restorationism, pastiche, monarchy or whatever. I really don't want to emphasize that.
I have to say that comment was slightly more aimed at Panama Hat than you. No offense or anything, Panama, but you are. I am. So
sorry, I'm a political activist.
Well, you are overtly political on the internet, right?
Well, aren't we all?
Yes. Yeah. No, absolutely. I am too. This is not criticism, but what I mean is, from when we've had discussions where I've heard you expressing your view of things, that's what I was speaking to specifically, rather than UAM. Not because, of course, you don't.
Could I just ask how so? Because I basically would ascribe to myself everything that AM just said about himself.
Yeah, but you are trying to formulate the authentic reaction, right? And so it's this to create an idealized framework. Would you like to give me a quick rundown of what it is this authentic reaction would ideally look like at the end?
Well, again, this isn't a political prescription. It's a reaction. It's a lens through which one can view the decline into the modernity we live in a way that is truest, it's closest to truth. It's not. I'm not constructing a idealized way of looking at the world, or arguing that we should build this or that. I'm simply giving an intellectual method, as such, is what I'm trying to do.
I mean, it's essentially, Carl, what Panama and I are doing is holding true to some conception of reality as independent of the system we're currently in, and trying to hold true to that, despite the fact that we have no political power and no means of realizing some sort of political objective, nor do we want to offer a political prescription. I think, this is I hate to ascribe this, but, this is quite Evolian, this notion of, living a man amongst the ruins.
I don't believe in a political solution to the mess we're in currently.
Well, even a revolution is a political solution, right? I mean,
but I'm not arguing.
You don't believe in a democratic solution, which I think is a fair thing, right?
I don't believe that there is one singular way out of this mess that I will tie myself to. Basically, if all of a sudden some based uprising started just in the realm of fantasy and was like, right, we're gonna rebuild a healthy civilization in Europe, I'd probably say, okay, let's throw our lot in with them. But I'm not arguing for, here's how we're gonna take it down, and here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna build this and do that. There isn't any point to that, in my opinion, and also because I don't see myself as anywhere near the sort of person that could do that. I'm just the person that reads books.
I mean, Carl, we're not Leninists. I mean, if we were to adopt some, just to play this, if we were to adopt some form of Leninist viewpoint, it would simply be to end this, to clear out the current cabal who are currently in power. It wouldn't be focused like Leninism is on achieving utopia on Earth through the vanguard of the proletariat.
No, of course not. But so. It seems, though, that there was, and I'm happy to, be corrected and say that I was misunderstanding the point. but in other discussions, when it's free flowing, it does seem that there's the focus on hierarchy, and this seems to be in direct opposition, of course, to the current socialist crop of politicians we have talking about equality, and that is a fair reaction to have against them. I think I'm absolutely sick of the word equality, and I would love to banish it from the lexicon.
I have this I have this recurring theme in things I've written that modernity leaves certain words with a stink, that you can smell a word like equality, for example.
The reason I bring any of this up, I suppose, is because it seemed like you, Panama, were advocating in some sense, and I'm not even. Again, just to be clear, I'm not saying it's a bad idea either, right? I'm not trying to condemn any of the ideas you guys have come up with. I mean, the reason I engage in these spaces and watch your content is because you're good thinkers. There's no question about it. And so there's, it's not that I have any disrespect for the ideas, but there seems to be a kind of a view that it would be good to have a firm hierarchy in place. And this is why democracy is a problem, because democracy interferes with hierarchies by allowing people who shouldn't be in the hierarchy to find their place in the hierarchy. And I think that I would defend democracy purely along political lines from that kind of English skepticism of power, and say, well, we kind of want a way of holding rulers accountable, even if it means this is a system with its own flaws. And it's got massive flaws, as we can see with the World Economic Forum. This can be infiltrated, and this can be turned against the people who it's supposed to serve. But something having a flaw, I mean, we didn't really know the World Economic Forum would come about. This is a discovered attribute, and is something that I think we should be aware of. And I'm totally skeptical of democracy in non-political arenas. Like, it's just not necessary in business or in the home or anywhere else. I'm not even certain. Like, I don't mind the idea of an elective presidency, but I find it I'm a bit sus about it as well. And this is a Trump supporter saying that. So.
Carl, the issue. Sorry, Panama, you go ahead.
Well, the thing is, I do kind of share this kind of English skepticism of power with you, but it's interesting because that's the exact reason that I would have the most mistrust for a democratic system, because you when you create a democracy, you create a very fast route for people who covet power and covet.
It's not just that democracy. It's not just that. We're talking about the popular will. We're talking about Rousseau. Democracy is a lie. All of this is just a fabrication. There has never been a democracy. Democracy is just as abstract as the idea of the people. We're not even against the idea of voting. I mean, what I've tried to emphasize in my role of the estates and balancing power, invariably, these estates were elected, often indirectly elected. You have town councils, you have guilds, you have local city mayors, and then, of course, you have the lords. It's just the fact that democracy is not the overarching consideration. The vote itself does not confer legitimacy. It is simply an aspect of a system. It doesn't become the legitimacy of the system. That is what we're trying to get across with this idea of a medieval conception of power. It's the idea that it's all of these forces working in tandem, not overriding each other. This again, the idea of an organic whole, a community, again, some form of nation, embryonic nation, coming together, and again, in some way, again, acknowledging the presence of something which is higher than themselves. So they can't, again, break this idea of the chain of tradition, which all of existence should essentially be a long series of, again, inheritance from the past that you wish to continue. That is the clear sort of indication that we're making. And when looking at the Estates General in France, the Estates General in France had a more liberal electoral system than the Legislative Assembly that came after it. So when we're talking about democracy, it's not the vote itself that we hate. It's the implications of the vote as circumventing everything else.
Well, okay, great. I mean, that I can completely agree with everything you said there. I suppose what I would say then is that's not necessarily clear in the way that it's discussed in these circles, because I'm not a native of these circles, so this had obviously passed me by somewhat.
I mean, it's just classic de Maistre. I'm not advocating anything original. I mean,
yes,
I'm not. I'm not. Again, it's not criticism either.
The thing is, Carl, and this is going to sound okay. What I'm about to say may, for the time being, tank my popularity, shall we say, in some of these circles, and I don't want to sound arrogant or that sort of thing, but the position that AM and I take is kind of a you might call it a learned position, because I think me and him are both quite, you might say, bookish. Yeah, and the thing is, this position that we're taking is also a minority, I think. A lot of the bigger names and a lot of the more popular currents in these communities are, it's not that the ideas are bad per se, it's just that they're far less considered, I think, and far less they're far more easy to grasp by more people, if you see what I mean. I think so.
There's a quick thing that I completely understand where you're coming from here, by the way. I totally understand. I suppose I was speaking more to this popular idea that comes from the overall broadcast of this sphere of the internet, rather than your particular individual nuanced positions, because I'm not an expert or anything on what this area thinks. I've just been watching and trying to figure out what it is that is virtuous here, frankly, and what is useful and good, and what can be better expressed in my own work. And there is a great deal here, I think. I mean, a lot of what I've learned in this space has definitely informed my understanding of what conservatives are lacking in, and it's been very, very helpful. So, I mean, yeah, you may have made yourself unpopular with some purists there, Panama. But it's not clear that this area of the internet feels that way necessarily. That's, I think, the point I'm trying to make there.
Yes. I mean,
I spend a lot of time here. So
AM and I are still, I think, in quite a minority.
Right.
At least. I mean, there are just other, we're just one of several currents. But again, I don't want to speak for AM, but my whole idea with this idea of an authentic reaction is to build an intellectual an intellectual core, if you will, that is most representative of the traditions, the history, and the reality that we come from, basically.
I mean, Panama, I'm going to go for, I'm not even interested in building a core. I mean, I'm just interested in myself having a framework. I mean, if people take something from this and begin to inculcate these ideas, that's wonderful. But I have no sort of interest in propagating my message. This is sort of very personal for me. This is, my relationship with, with God and my own sort of pursuit of being a good, honest person, trying to live by the truth. The truth, it is just the truth as far as I'm concerned. I'm not interested in appealing to a wider constituency or trying to convince people. If that is a byproduct of this, then that's wonderful. But I think that the fact that people in the space will obviously disagree with me, and I have had disagreements, albeit virtually everything has been cordial, but there are subtle disagreements. I'm interested in that. I'm interested in having these discussions and arriving at something which is closer to the truth. And I'm not just going to adopt a dogmatic position, declare that I'm right all the time, and want to build a core of people who treat me as if I am right all the time.
Yeah, exactly.
Anyway, unless, Carl, you have any final statements, we really need to get onto the super chats.
Yeah, no, I just think this is a very fascinating discussion, and I've very much enjoyed it. I wasn't having a good time.
I wouldn't mind having another one of these at some point. And also, could I know we've got to get onto super chats, but could I ask the two of you one thing? It's somewhat off topic, but just something that's kind of that sort of is interesting to me. So obviously we've talked a lot about England and its kind of polity. So to the two of you as Englishmen, how do you see England's conception among the other nations that exist on the Isles, essentially? For example, like do you kind of see it like England being England being like an Austria and Scotland being a Hungary, and if you see what I mean. Or do you think that there's a particular, especially directed at you, Carl, do you think that the English have a particular right, if you will, to be the dominant power on the Isles? And within that, what do you see the place of the Celts, if you will, as being?
The right to be the dominant power. That's an interesting framing. I mean, given the proportions of the nations of Britain, I think it's inevitable that England is a dominant power, the dominant power of the British Isles. I think it's probably for the best in many ways, because I am kind of skeptical of Celtic political thought, especially in the modern day. Now, I mean, I'm not an expert or anything.
I mean, it's all Poznan nowadays, anyway.
Exactly, but I just can't stand what the Celtic countries are doing to themselves, and I don't understand why they're doing it. And it seems to just be against a hatred of England, frankly, that they do it. And it's like, okay, well, then,
and a hatred of themselves, I think.
Well, yeah, I agree. I think it's a hatred of themselves. I think there's a kind of bitterness that they lost the wars to England, basically.
Honestly, it's speaking from South Wales. It's not even so much that, it's that a lot of people want to be seen as superior to England in all aspects, and one of the things that they do is they say, well, we're better at being progressive than the English are. So even though we have that's why the Scots are so keen to just completely wipe out the native Scots in favor of Asians and things like that.
But that's deeply ironic if you look at the current state of, say, immigration. No, England's way more progressive than Scotland is.
And they'll try anyway. They'll do it anyway.
Yeah, they will. Somehow we've beaten the Scots yet again, even at the worst game. I think that the Celts don't realise the high regard that the English hold them in. Actually, this is something I've noticed. English people generally don't really see the Celts as being different in a sort of moral sense, right? They're not foreigners. Foreigner is a particular category that non-English speaking and non-sort of native people get put into, which there's a distinct boundary there that the Celts don't fall outside of, I think, and that's I guess to the credit of the English in a way, but again, it's very parochial, and I don't want to say xenophobic, because it's not the right word. It's not the English hate or despise foreign cultures, but there's just a time and a place, right?
I think the best person to actually look to here is probably Tolkien and the Hobbits. It's just a general sort of caution towards anything they would consider to be queer, off, odd, foreign. It's not something which is chauvinistic or intensely xenophobic or violent. But just to answer my point on this, obviously I have a bit of Celtic blood too, so I'm going to try and represent this idea of some form of harmony between the nations. But I mean, my conception is basically classically Stuart. I'm not pro the United Kingdom as it's currently incarnated. I'm much more of to go back to a Scotland in personal union and Ireland in personal union with the Crown. The Welsh situation in that is a bit more complicated. Obviously, whether it's going to be an autonomous principality or go back to the Marchers or what have you. But yes, I mean, I'm very much interested in the commingling of Celtic and English cultures, and that fascinating legacy, which I will be doing at some point on my channel when I've got Nations of Charlemagne and Orthodoxy, Autocracy, Nationality done. But yes, in terms of a political manifesto, I don't have any sort of hostility, but I am a particularist within these isles, so I support the Scottish having some form of a system which is pre-1707, like that with Ireland. Of course, I can't look to any sort of classic example with Ireland, because Ireland was never unified, even though they had high kings. And when Ireland was unified under England, it was an Anglican church being thrusted on a mainly Catholic population. So again, as I'm pointing out, I'm looking at historical examples which inform my thinking, but I'm in no way envisaging that there's any sort of solution based on that can possibly come out in the future. A independent Scotland, as we see it, is going to become some sort of horrific outpost of the European Union. It's not going to become amicable relationship in some sort of monarchical, symphonia with England.
Perhaps I should have said at the start. I asked in a traditional conception of the nations of
yes,
World,
traditional
not
conception, three kingdoms. Yeah. Anyway, on to the super chats.
Yes, just can I? You just the way you conceived of it there, like the skepticism of the queer and the strange. That's a fantastic conception, because the Scots and the Welsh and the Irish don't fall into that. That's what I was trying to get at. They're not queer and strange. They're just the Scots and the Celts.
You ask, I suppose.
Well, no, well, you know what I mean. Like they're not foreigners, bizarre foreigners from overseas whose ways we don't understand, and so there's remarkable tolerance for the Scots and the Celts, I think.
Super chats, right? Jacob for $10. Thank you very much. Something's wrong here. I opened Locke's 2 treatises of government and it just said go to the lotuseaters.com to get access to all the premium content we can have on the site.
Ironically, a lot of what we do is actually repudiating Locke these days. So.
Well, based.
Yeah. Not in quite the strident terms that you might, perhaps, but.
I'm not a complete apologist for Filmer, as we pointed out, or Bruce Wayne. Thank you for that. Narco Republican for $5. I must remind Carl that in his interview with Janis Koremicki, he alluded to Nicolas Gomez de Villa as the greatest philosopher of the 20th century. Well, there you have it. So
I agree.
I'm sure he did. It's probably 4 years ago or something. I can't really remember it.
Academic agent for £10. Hilaire Belloc contends that after 1688, ruthless foreign merchants destroyed the high trust customs and culture Sargon describes and transformed it totally by 1900. Discuss.
May well be true. I'll have to read that book.
I didn't want to. I deliberately avoided it because I don't know how much controversy AM can hold on his channel. But I did wonder if, talking about England and the British Isles, we should discuss the ethnic makeup of them as an important thing, perhaps.
Yes, I know what academic agent is alluding to here.
Yes, I think he's getting it.
Yes, and I'm not really that comfortable discussing it on YouTube. I've alluded to aspects of it indirectly, but I mean, in terms of just the foreign merchants, I mean, yes, go back to Disraeli, the tragic 19th century reactionary who facilitated full throttle democracy. His conception, again, like Carlyle's conception of the Glorious Revolution, was the conquest of England by Dutch finance. That is the sort of the traditional sort of reactionary view, and of course this isn't necessarily true because the Whigs were like an aristocratic core. There was a huge mercantilist element to it, but even we need to understand that Holland endured as a major financial power well throughout the 18th century, even when we were beating up the French in the 7 Years' War. And in fact, it was actually Dutch finance which facilitated the American War of Independence. So this idea that London has always been, since 1688, the center of Dutch finance is wrong. But that definitely becomes much more so the case after the Napoleonic Wars, during which, of course, the Netherlands is occupied by France and essentially demolished. It comes back in a much weaker form. Joseph Langmead for £10 for all. What are your thoughts on the feudal system versus the absolutist centralized one, considering absolutism was actually a fairly new phenomenon historically? I think in fairness, we've covered this quite extensively and how it informs all our understanding. But yes, the fairly new phenomena historically, like I said in my lecture yesterday, absolutism arises due to a breakdown in the natural constitution of nations. So when you have a facet such as the nobility, who are wanting to convert to a different religion like the Huguenots in France, or the Lutherans in Germany. And of course, they're wanting to actively, intervene in the politics of, the court, siding with, one particular regent over another when there's a minority. This completely breaks down the idea that feudalism is supposed to have this deference, from the peasant to the lord, up into the king. When the system breaks down, the absolutist monarchies resulted solve the situation temporarily by circumventing feudalism and opting for managerialism.
God, is that not just a perfect description of what's happening now with social justice?
Yes, albeit the ideology was completely different, it should be mentioned.
Well, of course, but like the principle is exactly what's happening.
Yes, the political apparatus is incredibly similar. And of course, what happens during this managerial system is that in order for absolute monarchy to remain, the sanctity of the monarch and this idea of the monarch as the literal representative of God's power on earth needs to be maintained. However, when the monarch no longer exemplifies this idea of absolutist perfection, like I said, it puts a huge strain on the person of the monarch and his officials. Once these officials begin to degenerate and this core belief in this understanding fails, then it simply devolves into a form of pure managerialism, and then it becomes incredibly easy to pick apart. Sorry,
this just strikes me as exactly what is happening now. I mean, look at what's happening to Trudeau right now. He looks like he's under a huge amount of strain. Obviously, I don't sympathize with his position, but like, look at the man. It looks like things are going terribly for him. And the extreme managerialism that you mentioned. I mean, how is this just not exactly the political system we find ourselves in?
I mean, I compared him on UO to a satrap, essentially, like a Persian satrap. He's a governor for wokeism, essentially.
Sure, but he also, I think, has a lot of these sort of absolutist characteristics.
In fairness to absolutism, again, we're talking like, critiquing libertarianism. When we're talking about managerialism, we're talking about a system without a fundamental ideological core, but just as the system is. Someone on the chat has been wanting me to refer to other systems of absolutism which weren't covered by this topic, which is talking about, the Res Publica Christiana, Western Europe and England. The examples they brought up were Russia and China. Yes, if you have a fundamentally a notion of legitimacy which is bound up absolutely in this idea of autocracy, absolutism, and again in Russia is harkening back to patriarcha, the idea that the Tsar is the little father of the people, and that again it follows the same pattern. Absolutism in Russia arose due to a conflict between the boyars, who were seen to be disloyal and favoring Sweden and Poland and Lithuania over Russia. Nevertheless, what was achieved in Russia was this, you can say, indissoluble link between orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality. And so therefore, there are elements of this where the state sort of ideology behind absolutism does continue and almost becomes inculcated. I mean, you were saying, Sargon, about this idea of something ineffable about the English people. Well, what happened in Russia is that this became part of the Russian national psyche, and there were certain interruptions. So, for example, when you have Peter the Great and the creation of the Window of the West, there's definitely a view which dominated Russian culture throughout the majority of the 19th century. Albeit, again, there were elements of political sort of aspects of all stripes, and of course, looking to China, China operated under a system which was. It was called legalism, but it was absolutism in almost the purest sense, in the sense that the monarch was the emperor, the son of heaven, Huangdi, was not confined by any sort of political apparatus or system. You later had elements like Confucianism, which were brought in to try and temper that and create this idea of, family, natural hierarchy, etc. But originally, China was conceived as a purely despotic state, and again a state exhibiting all the facets of absolutism, including the ability to levy armies and bureaucracies en masse. And this is a facet which continued in Chinese civilization under the auspices of the mandate of heaven. And again, the mandate of heaven is very similar to the idea of Locke's revolution. You have an absolutist system, but when that absolutist system degenerates, it collapses, and it is replaced by a better absolutist system, which degenerates, is replaced by a better absolutist system. So there are exceptions to this rule, and I think it's therefore interesting to bring in non-European examples to understand this notion of absolutism and not just equate it with leftism, because obviously it's the ideology that sort of informs the state, not just the facet of managerialism. Right, where was I? Sage says, I'm very glad for Sargon to be coming in, small but wise and very knowledgeable. Well, that's wonderful. I hope Sargon appreciates the comment. We're very lucky to have him here.
Thank you.
The moron pill, in contrast to wise and very knowledgeable.
No, I endorse this already. Go on.
5 euros. Ethnos is a fossil fuel. Burnt coal is no longer coal. It's gone. Ethnos may have got us somewhere good, but it will not help us out. Shared ideas will. There is a facet of truth to that, and I fundamentally agree. I mean, something we didn't really get into, which was intended to be brought up, partly because it didn't really relate to Englishness, it more related to the French example in the Revolution, or that of sort of and again German nationalism, that of ethnic nationalism, and of the ethnos, of the body of the people as comprised of the Volk or Lippop, the people, making essentially forming a political body. And of course, this is why the Germans considered themselves democratic, because the body of the Führer was simply the incarnation of the will of the Volk, of the people. Of course, if you remove the people, if you dilute the people, or if you miscegenation, what have you, and there is no longer any body that is there, but the ideas will sustain. And look at the course of European history. I mean, look at the great migrations. For all intents and purposes, it appeared that Roman civilization had been wiped out in Western Europe during the 5th century. The ethnic sort of stock of Romans, were interbred with Lombards, with Franks, with Visigoths. Of course, then you have the invasion of the Umayyads into Spain, and then you have Muslim presence there as well. And yet, out of all of this, there was still an enduring aspect of Romanitas, or Roman civilization, that coalesced 300 years later with the Carolingian Empire and with the Holy Roman Empire. And so these ideas, again, remembering this hallowed time, this in the long, long ago, transcends this idea of a political association purely based on ethnos or ethnicity.
AM confirmed Civnat. Got it.
I'm not making it irrelevant. I'm saying it's possible.
I'm sorry, I was just winding you up.
No, I understand, but no. Again, I often sort of define myself in opposition to what I'm not. Considering most Civnats are insufferable Tory boys, I completely disavow. Avaloc for $5 Brazilian. Thank you very much. Did we not change the definition of liberty with the times? The medievals had a conception of liberty that's foreign to us. Well, yes, well, going back to the quote I used at the beginning from EVKL, we have no shared definition of liberty, and our conception has indeed changed over time. What Carl has been referring to is this hallowed ancient idea of liberty, which is always a system of hearkening back to remembering some form of precedent based on this almost ineffable quality of the English people. But one aspect I find absolutely fascinating, when we look at liberalism in the 19th century Europe, it's almost a core political philosophy. But if you look at it in America, liberal is just a euphemism for progressive. In that sense, it has absolutely no value at all.
I mean, liberty as well. There's a collective notion to it in the pre-modern era that doesn't translate now. And the Keir Starmer kind of came a cropper on this when some woman phoned him up on LBC and was like, "Well, Israel has the self-determination of their people. Don't we have the same right?" And Keir was like, "Yeah, of course, but," and I mean, this took both sides and made them furious, because on one side he's admitting that there is a collective liberty of a people from the progressive side, which is haram, and then on the other side it's like, yeah, Israel deserves this collective liberty, but you don't, and it was quite the faux pas. I quite enjoyed it.
Anu Ra for £20. Cannot catch it live, and thank you very much for the £20. Cannot catch it live, but been looking forward to this. Have this a pre-decimalization pound? Well, thank you very much. If it was pre-decimalization pound, I'd be very honoured to get £20 from you. Thank you very much. Do you regard Locke's support for property rights as insincere, given his opposition to legitimate succession to the throne? No, I don't think it was insincere from Locke. I think, in fairness to Locke, I do believe he was fundamentally a Christian, albeit there was enough ambiguity within his political philosophy which could bring people away from a Christian understanding towards towards atheism. But I'm sorry, but looking at the the Whigs and the the Tories who were duped into supporting William of Orange, and I look at Edmund Burke's conception, they didn't believe they were usurping. They termed it in a way that James II had forfeited the throne because he ran. And of course, this is a tried and true case of history, that whenever a king quits his kingdom, he has essentially abdicated, even though he hasn't formally abdicated, and James II would claim the throne regardless. It's more difficult to justify when you look at the instance of his son, James III, and in order to justify his deposition, people had to rely on the fact that he was potentially a changeling, and this was basically a bastard put in the crib. And this is something that was circulated quite widely by James's own daughter Anne, that her half brother was in fact a bastard. So that to me is the more controversial point of view, because under any sort of tradition of monarchy, what you would do once James II had been deposed is you would establish a regency. William of Orange and Mary would have come in as regents, and they would have governed on behalf of the child king, who would have then only been one when he succeeded to the throne. And what that would have meant effectively is that you have a potential to inculcate James into this new post-Glorious Revolution situation. But of course, they didn't do that. William of Orange wanted the throne. He was prepared to leave England and basically usher in civil war, were he not granted the throne. And he wanted the throne for his own purposes in terms of bringing Britain into opposition against France. And as a result of that, the advocates of the Glorious Revolution and the Tories had to concede and offer him the throne. And as a result, I mean, there's no way of arguing for it. He had a claim on the throne, but he was not the heir to the throne. So it was, by all accounts, a usurpation. And that usurpation was confirmed with the Act of Succession, which barred Catholics from inheriting.
Can I add a quick thing on Locke there? I've been critical of him, of course, in this stream, saying essentially he was a half-wit. And there's a distinct unfairness that I think that we have 300 years or 200 years after the fact, with huge amounts of scholarship that have allowed us, and in retrospect, to be able to look back and say, well, Berkeley was right. He was ushering in atheism. He was wrong on all of these points, blah, blah, blah. But at the time, they were at the cutting edge of intellectual thought. They didn't know where it was going to go or what it was going to produce. And so I think there's a defense of them there that's warranted.
No, I completely agree with you. It's very dangerous to bring in deterministic thoughts when you're evaluating people within a certain historical context.
Yeah.
Even though in hindsight we can say the slippery slope was real.
Yes.
Panama Hat seems to have left us. I hope he comes back. I hope it was just a temporary internet outage or what have you. Right. Roan for €5. The Anglo-Saxon view of kingship is not in any way dissimilar. So the view of kingship that of other Germanic tribes had.
Agree.
Yes, but it's quite difficult to judge that due to our limited knowledge of the construction of German tribes. I mean, the only state which was really similar to like Wessex would have been the main kingdom in that sort of time frame, would have been the Saxons. And of course, the Saxons were also pagans well after we had begun to convert. So it's rather difficult to bring in any sort of meaningful comparison other than drawing back to these ancient allusions to the German tribes. And of course, if you count the Carolingians and the Merovingians as Germans, because they were originally Salian Franks from the east bank of the Rhine, who became Frankified, Gallicized rather, then if that's a German conception of monarchy, again, interesting question. I'm not quite sure how to answer that. I'll have to answer it at a later point. The Dank Cone for $2. Thank you very much. Just thank you for the stream. Well, it's been a pleasure to host it. Marty for $20 Canadian. Thank you very much. I'm glad to see that the Canadian government hasn't frozen your bank account yet, Marty. And he just sends
we
a smiley.
don't, but that really might happen.
I know, that was a very dark joke. Anyway,
Yeah.
Just gives a smiley face. Oh, Panama's back. Just add him.
Oh, okay.
Here we are. You're back. Hello. Okay, we still haven't got sound. Anyway, he just sends a smiley face. So thank you very much, Marty, for the $20. It is very much appreciated. Bolero393 for $10. Thank you very much. The remake of The Lion in Winter will have Idris Elba as Henry II, Salma Hayek as Eleanor of Aquitaine, and Queen Latifah as Thomas Becket. It's about how Black English women invented democracy. I'd be willing to see that. I'd be willing to see that. That sounds
I want
fun.
to see how Queen Latifah plays Thomas Becket.
Yeah, I'll be interested to see how. I'll be interested to see the death of Queen Latifah in Canterbury Cathedral. No,
that sounds great.
That's wonderful.
Middleton Priest removed.
Who would play Richard the Lionheart? Who would play John? Who would play the young Henry? So many questions for this hypothetical remake that we may see. I'm not going to say we're not going to see it, given the way things are going.
You certainly can't rule it out, can you?
No. Knight Rider of Albi for £10. Thank you very much. The only way our fellow men can be made trustworthy is if they are imbued with the blood-tied spirit that Chad warrior priest king champions above himself and all else earthly, all looking skyward. Yes, well, very possibly. I do believe that tribal associations, extended families, and bloodlines do matter. I don't want to give the impression that I am an extreme Sivnap, because I'm not. I just don't believe it's the sole determining factor.
There has to be a deep relationship between the people, though, and this is the thing with the Celts and the Scots. The Celts, there's a deep relationship there. It's over 1,000 years long, so it's very, very deep.
Absolutely, you can't just import a new civilization overnight or in one generation and expect it to be just as harmonious as something forged over 1,000 years and how many generations.
Yeah.
Right. Bolero 393 again. Thank you very much for $5. Henry V was an absolute Chad, best portrayed in film by Branagh. Olivier was also great, but Hiddleston and Chamelet were terrific. Yeah, I think I really enjoyed the Branagh interpretation of Shakespeare's Henry V. I can't really hope for anything better than that. And of course, never forget the rightful claim that we have over France. Even more so because France has been in anarchy technically since 1871 without a king. So all the more reason for the English to come over and proclaim our rightful claim to France.
Co-signed.
Toglos for £20. Clear them out. Absolutely. We just need that Jonathan Bowden clip to play. Sadly, I don't have it in my my StreamYard's catalogue. Maybe I'll get that for next time. Ivan 95 for €10. Sargon, AA is not a reactionary. Maybe that confuses you about messaging. Do you want to answer that?
I will let him define himself. I'm sure that you're correct, but I suppose what I was speaking to is the general ethos of the community, which I think can be fairly characterized as reactionary, and I don't mean that in derogatory terms. So.
I mean, as far as I'm concerned, AA is still a classical liberal, isn't he?
Well, he's Iranian, so I don't know if he's allowed.
But anyway, yes, we'll let AA define his own political label. But as we've
Mad
discussed,
Muller of Cardiff,
we
all know he's actually a Nazi. Yeah.
No, he's truly unique, as we're all espousing here. Discard your cheap political labels.
Yeah.
Right. SV Perusa for $10. Are you guys familiar with Curtis Yarvin? And if so, how do you feel about his work? I am familiar with Curtis Yarvin. I think we all are familiar with Curtis Yarvin. However, I don't feel comfortable really going into depth about my relationship with Curtis Yarvin, simply because there are many NRX people in our community who have gone over Curtis Yarvin ad nauseum and in much more depth and understanding than I'll ever hope to achieve. So I would redirect you to other channels like Oron McIntyre, Charlemagne. But as for my own understanding, it is comparatively primitive compared to their work. Anyone else?
No, it's a great summary for me as well.
I personally, part of the reason I was so keen to use the term authentic reactionary as opposed to just reactionary is to avoid confusion with NRX. I think for some people it's a useful gateway, but personally I find it inadequate and quite lacking. I find it too specifically related to the issues of modern day America in a lot of its tone.
You're so snobbish.
Yes,
it's rank punditry.
Yes, and on the whole, I'm not a fan of it, really.
Right, the moron pill again. Thank you very much for €5. Bitterness does not even slightly describe Ireland. The South defeated the English and is very proud. The proud North is more patriotic than England. Yes, but Irish nationalism has turned into something which is, again, very similar to what's happening in Scotland. Sinn Féin is not advocating for a united Ireland, and again, they used to do it obviously through terrorism and force, because they're wanting to unite Ireland based on some principles of Catholic republicanism, like Eamon de Valera was. No, instead they're wanting to unite Ireland so it could be more readily received by the POS. I'm not sure.
I've spoken to lots of Irish people over the course of my life, and one of the things that just strikes out is the England looms large in their minds, and the Celtic nations just don't loom large in the minds of the English. So,
well, yes, I mean, in fairness to Ireland,
I'm not saying they don't have a just cause or anything.
No, they do have a legitimate just cause vis-a-vis the Scots. Scots nationalism, as far as I'm concerned, is based off Braveheart. But as for Irish nationalism, that is a fascinating topic. Again, how that interrelates with those in Northern Ireland who would identify themselves as British before they would identify themselves as Irish. All this is fascinating, but I really need time to delve into all of the intricacies, because as everyone watching this is definitely aware of by now, I don't do anything in a concise manner. I have to do everything with an excessive amount of intricacy and possibly, again, information that isn't really needed to get across. But there you are. I mean, people do sort of refer to it as, England's first colony. I hate using language which is obviously meant to draw the obvious comparison with the scramble for Africa. But I mean, the whole sort of relationship with Ireland, it is a conquest state. It is, unlike Aquitaine, unlike Anjou, Maine, and Normandy, which were part of the English patrimony. They weren't conquered. They were parts of France, which were dynastically held in union with England. Ireland and Wales were physically conquered. Ireland was conquered by Henry II, and Wales was conquered by Edward I. And he tried it and failed to conquer Scotland. The English Loyalist for €10. Whether you're English, Scots, Welsh, Northern Irish, in the end, you're all white in the eyes of these leftists. They are broken and scattered. What is a good book on the subject of English liberalism? Like surmising English liberalism, I really would have to sort of go back through my catalogue and look. As you're probably all aware, I'm terrible at remembering books and authors, especially when I'm talking about them. But Carl is perhaps the best person to ask on this. So, Carl.
I honestly would consider what I have espoused here to be an innovative thought of my own. I don't think I could recommend a book that would hold this position as I've explained it.
Fair enough. Philippocrit for €5. To the breakdown of feudal structures, the power that brings itself to expression through a king or ruler of any kind, is justified by said king. The power that brings itself to expression through a king is justified by said. No, it's not justified by said king in isolation. It's justified on the presumption that the king is acting as a vice regent, that he's acting through God, but he justifies that power on the basis of the breakdown of the feudal structures. So absolutism, as defined in terms of this teleology of the modern state, absolutism just means that the king has a monopoly of violence within the state. And that is, again, the sort of basis of modernity is actually the writ of absolutism. The fact that nobles are being circumvented from this feudal filial connection with the king as their father. And instead, this function of executing violence and justice is instead exercised directly by the king and through his appointed ministers, rather than through this ancient connection with lords in relation to their king, and of course the connection that those lords hold to the land. Right. Bell, Forrest and Knight for $5. Thank you very much. I don't know liberalism occurs along the Rise of Enclosures Act. Very fishy. I think it's just another form of centralization, be it English or continental. Occurs along the rise of the Enclosure Act. I don't know if liberalism occurs along the rise. Well, no, the Enclosure Act was, when was it? The 16th century. And obviously there were many more sort of enclosure acts sort of going on. But again, we're talking about liberalism. I mean, liberalism as defined, Whiggery predated liberalism. Liberalism arises in the 19th century in England. It's the force that's sort of the propelling movement behind the 1832 Great Reform Act. So what we sort of can quantify as political liberalism, which isn't harkening back to this ancient conception of liberalism, which is, again, on the basis of liberty, the liberty of the subject, which is in some ways eternal, based on the conceptions of liberty that we've been trying to hash out here. Liberalism is sort of towards the tail end of the enclosure system. But for more information on that, I did a stream a very long time ago with Radical Liberation over on his channel discussing this, because I can't quite remember at this time, but thank you nevertheless for the super chat. Ivan95 again for €5. I support your claim to the throne of the new Austro-Hungarian Empire. Well, there is already a claimant. It is the Habsburg claimant. I'm not going to usurp the rightful Emperor to Austria and King of Hungary based on nothing. Then I think I might make a good king. I don't think I'll make a good king. I think I'll be a pretty awful king. But thank you, nevertheless. Like I said, I've made explicit on this stream, I have no interest in espousing any form of political philosophy, so I'm treated as any sort of political activist or form a movement around me. Absolutely not. If there is going to be some sort of based Jacobite claimant, or there is going to be some obscure member of the Habsburg royal family who decides I'm going to reunite all the provinces in Central Europe, absolutely, I would support them. But as for me, it'll be fun. It'll be what a wonderful LARP. Yes, but no, absolutely not. I have no interest in political power whatsoever. Machiavelli sucks to go for $5. Who is the greatest king of all time? Oh my goodness. I have absolutely no idea. Come to think of it, I mean, it would have to be sort of, I don't know, relative to the context. I mean, it would be
based on what standard?
Yes, based on what standard? I mean, what sort of tangible achievement are we setting? Are we setting, on the basis of, the king's sort of virtues or the king's sort of political acuity? I mean, if I were to...
We're doing it on physical prowess.
Yes.
Who was able to beat up the most Frenchmen? That's the question.
Well, if we're talking about physical prowess, it's probably Peter the Great, who was the greatest king, who he was, I think about, how tall was he? 6'7"? He was probably taller than that, and he one of his pastimes was just bending iron, just bending swords. It was just just child's play to him. But yeah, in terms of like relating this back, because this has been a stream on English liberalism and our own conception of England. I'll mention some kings who are truly great. Obviously, Elizabeth was a great queen. Henry VIII. Perhaps more controversially, the reason I wouldn't rate him as a great king is the fact that every centralizing maneuver he enacted, most notably being the seizure of monastic land and church land in England, was meant to prosecute his claims in France and Scotland, which ended absolutely terribly. He acquired one sort of key fortress in Terouanne early on in his reign, and then had to abandon it because he couldn't afford to maintain the upkeep. So it's quite pathetic in the grand scheme of things. Right. But as a king, as a conqueror, obviously Henry V, as a king sort of embodying...
Edward III doesn't get a look in there.
No, Edward III is a good king. I think Henry V was better, though. Henry V actually got the French to recognize him as heir to the throne and his son as king, whereas Edward III had... everyone seems to forget that Edward III's reign started off well up until... after the Battle of Poitiers, And then when the Treaty of Brittany was signed and the Black Prince was given control over, again, it was an area which was actually smaller than the Angevin Empire under Henry II. He had to abandon his claim to France. He entered into a period of senility after that, and very quickly afterwards, all of English claims in France were lost very quickly. So much so that by the end of the reign of Edward III, we basically had the same possessions we had at the beginning of his reign. Whereas if you look at Henry V, he died during the siege of Mont Saint Michel, and he left Britain in a indomitable position, not just in that region, but in Europe as a whole. Had he survived, or had his regent after him, Bedford, survived long enough and been able to deal with the king in Bourges, the Charles VII, and had he not had to deal with the fluke that was Joan of Arc, it is very possible that the English would have been able to establish some form of at least temporary rule, and by temporary a couple of generations over France. And I think that's a major accomplishment that can't be overlooked. And of course, I would also throw in Edward I as well as a great king.
And you've got to love that the French actually have to live with the fact that it took God to save them from the English.
But just think about it. Well, no, it's not just that. Just look at Agincourt, how a tiny army, which had been completely cut off, filled essentially of Welsh mercenaries and people let out of prison, was able to defeat the cream of the French aristocracy in battle. And despite
You're welcome, Carl.
It wasn't entirely Welsh mercenaries. Come on, there were plenty of English mercenaries there too. But I tell you, I'd love to do a stream sometime talking about just how England was able to be in a position where it was just smashing armies across Western Europe. Because
you were led by a Welsh king.
Well, this is one theory. Yeah,
that's subversive slander against Henry V. I won't have it.
Tudors were Welsh, weren't they?
Yeah, but they were awful, except for Elizabeth. Besides, I would claim that the Tudors only received their blood royal, their regality through the female line. All of their royal descent was matrilineal. The Tudor line itself was garbage.
Listen to this racism, anti-Welsh racism. Disgusting.
I mean, honestly, I start to support it, even if it's kind of pro-woman.
Right. I'll just see if there are any super chats, because otherwise that is it. In the meantime, Panama, anything you would like to say before you go?
Well, actually, there was just one to end on a verse. Carl's point very early in the stream about the English particularism when it comes to foreigners always puts me in mind of this verse of Chesterton's, which goes, I knew no harm of Bonaparte, and plenty of the squire, and so to fight the Frenchman, I did not much. Sorry.
Oh no,
I did not much.
I can't tell if you're cutting out or you're forgetting.
I'm actually stammering, unfortunately.
Oh, okay.
But basically, the point is, but I did bash their bagonets because they came arrayed to straighten out the rolling road an English drunkard made, is the verse. And it always puts me in mind of that. So yes, you can look at my channel for more on the idea of authentic reaction, which I hope has been cleared up by today. And you can go on, you can purchase me a coffee on this new thing that I've enabled. There'll be a two-parter video on Samuel Johnson next week. Well, this week now. And that's about it, really. I have a small book of poetry available on Amazon currently, and there will be more books to follow this year.
Well, thank you very much, and it's been wonderful to have you on Panama. Carl, anything you would like to say before we leave?
No, just thank you so much for having me. This has been tremendous fun. Really enjoyed it.
Well, it's been a pleasure to have you on, Carl. We have to do this again sometime.
Yes, indeed.
Indeed. So yes, for my stuff, there's really nothing to shill. I mean, become a channel member, go to Subscribestar, like and comment on the video, subscribe to the channel, etc. Other than that, thank you all very much for listening, and good night.